Chapter 281, Outtweets. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. There were 5 black-winged griffins in the sky. They were hovering against the wind with their wings outstretched. Each of these griffins was 20 or 30 feet in size. The sharp claws of their hind legs and their torso bore a resemblance to that of a lion's. However, their head, front claws, and wings looked like that of an eagle's. The black feathers on their body appeared to be very thick and sturdy, as if they were made of cast iron. And, their seemingly incisive eyes were suffused with a glowing red radiance. However, the thing that seemed particularly unusual was that each griffin wore a black helmet on top of its head. A blood-red crystal stone that was almost the size of a clenched fist was embedded in the middle of those helmets. The crystal stones appeared unusually smooth. They were giving off a faint blood-red radiance. The surface of the crystals seemed to be like that of a mirror, and it seemed as it was reflecting everything below it. Furthermore, the formidable aura that these 5 griffins were emitting signified that these birds had reached the Xian realm. The expression in their eyes was limpid. It looked distinct from that of ordinary demon beasts. It seemed from their expression that they didn't possess low intelligence. Suddenly, a glimmer of blood-red light flashed in the helmet of one of the bigger griffins among them. That griffin seemed to have received some orders since it opened its mouth soon after. Then, it issued a hoarse and unpleasant cry. The other griffins in the vicinity also responded with a cry as they heard this noise. The 5 griffins dispersed after they had communicated with each other. And, they flew in different directions. One of them happened to pass through the sky over the mountain peak on which Shi Mu was hiding. Shi Mu's face gleamed with exultation as he saw this. He waved his hand, and took out the sky-splitting bow. Then, the sky-splitting bow began to expand with a flash of green light. In fact, it had expanded to half the size of a man in an instant. Shi Mu then flipped his hand, and took out 3 wind-chasing arrows. After that, he knocked the arrow. Simultaneously, he mumbled something, and 3 white chains emerged before his eyes. Then, these chains wound around the wind-chasing arrows. The black-winged griffin in the air felt a sudden jolt in its heart. The instincts of that savage beast made it feel a trace of shudder. In fact, it seemed as if it had felt that it was being closely watched by someone. It was about to examine the surrounding area when a black silhouette suddenly appeared in the vicinity. That silhouette swooped from the side at an insanely high speed. The griffin saw that it was a parrot with multicolored feathers. There were 2 feathers on the top of that parrot's head, one white and one red. Those 2 feathers were unusually striking. "Quack quack, big fellow, you are just a lowly servant of the heavenly demon sect. But, you still dare to flagrantly roam around in our sacred Xixia country. I'm the noble guardian spirit bird of the Dark Moon cult. The Dark Lord has sent me to annihilate you," the parrot issued a series of shouts. A flash of red radiance burst out of the parrot's body after he had completed his speech. After that, he opened his mouth, and spurted out a small mass of flames. It was aimed at the black-winged griffin. The black-winged griffin indeed possessed some intelligence. However, its wisdom hadn't grown to the extent where it could be compared with that of a human's. Therefore, it didn't seem to understand the meaning of the parrot's discourse. The griffin instead shot a contemptuous look at Cai when it realized that the might of the flames was feeble to an unreasonable limit. In fact, these flames might even fail to lit up timber. The griffin waved its wings, and a strong wind swept out. It extinguished the little flame, and rolled out toward the clamorous parrot. But then, a sharp whistling sound rang out in the air, as if something was piercing through the air. It was the sound of the 3 green arrows which were shot at an incredibly high speed. They looked like 3 green lightning bolts. It appeared as if they had taken the shape of a character. They had reached to only a few feet away from the griffin's body within the blink of an eye. They were targeting the chest and wings of the griffin. Moreover, there was a person's silhouette underneath the arrow. The silhouette was supported by a white chi cloud. It approached the griffin at an astonishing speed. The black-winged griffin got alarmed. It waved its wings, and swiftly changed its direction. Then, it changed its movement from a forward flight to a dive. Consequently, the 3 green arrows brushed past its body, and failed to hit their target. Shi Mu stood on the white chi cloud below. The corners of his mouth curled into an arc as he pointed out his finger. 3 white chains darted out of the arrow the moment they brushed past the griffin's body. Then, they wrapped around the griffin in a convenient manner, as if they were under someone's control. The black-winged griffin exuded a loud scream as if it had gotten struck by an overwhelming fear. Its body emanated a mass of splendid black luminescence. This radiance then condensed into a layer of black protective screen on the surface of its body. The 3 white chains wiggled to tighten their grip, but they were blocked by the black light screen for some time. However, the flight of the griffin had been greatly affected by these chains. So, the griffin slid, and started to fall downwards as a result. Whiz whiz whiz! 7 or 8 wash basin-sized fireballs emerged beside Shi Mu's body the next moment. They then started to spin. Then, they dashed toward the griffin while issuing shrill ear-piercing sound. Simultaneously, Shi Mu bent his bow, and knocked the arrows once again. 3 green arrows were projected once again. However, they intended to hit the griffin this time. They dashed toward the griffin while streaking 3 green traces in the air. The griffin was thunderstruck since it knew that it couldn't fly properly at the moment. It also knew that he wouldn't be able to dodge the arrows because of this. Therefore, it stretched open its mouth, and puffed out a mass of scorching black flames. The black flames congealed, and turned into a beam. Then, the beam of flames knocked against the approaching 7 or 8 fireballs all at once. A burst of chaotic rumbling sound rang out in the air as the fireballs changed into billowing hot waves, and dissipated in the air. But, the black column of fire was also defeated and dispersed. Meanwhile, the 3 green arrows darted like a meteor, and struck the black light shield that was wrapped around the griffin's body. Bang! The black light shield got blown to smithereens the next moment. After that, the white chains tightened their grip, and firmly bound one of the wings of the griffin. The huge body of the griffin was no better than a stone without one of its wings, since it needed both of its wings to balance its body. Consequently, it started to fall downwards with an overwhelming momentum. Shi Mu's face beamed with happiness. He wielded one of his hands, and a streak of golden light burst out. It then coiled around the black-winged griffin's falling body the next moment. Then, a burst of blood-red light flashed. The huge head of the black-winged griffin got separated from its body, and flew out. Then, Shi Mu waved his hand to recall the golden sword as the griffin's body fell down to the ground. Quack quack! Several other black-winged griffins had also sensed this situation since they weren't very far. So, they had flown back under the leadership of a leader griffin. However, these griffins were too late to lend a hand even though they had flown back at an extremely fast speed. And, it had happened because Shi Mu's whole hunting process was very natural and unforced. In fact, this brief battle had taken only 3 or 4 breaths from the beginning to the end. Those griffins hovered in midair for some time, but they didn't dive to attack Shi Mu. Shi Mu landed on the ground. A mischievous smile spread across his face as he threw a glance at the hovering griffins. Then, he turned around and walked over to the griffin's corpse that lay not far from him. 2 nights later, in the Heavenly Wu Arms shop that was situated on the West Kuang Street in the eastern district of Qiang City. Hee, I hadn't expected dear friend Mu's skills to be so advanced. You obtained an entire black-winged griffin in such a short period of time. Su Lu looked at Shi Mu, and said with a smile as they sat in the reception area. I request Master Su to take care of the rest of the things. I will come back to collect the tools after 10 days, Shi Mu stood up and stated while cupping his hands in a respectful manner. Half an hour later, in a certain room, in the guest house building. Shi Mu looked at the scattered pile of goods, and stroked his chin. The trace of a thoughtful look could be seen on his face at this moment. These goods were the things that he had assembled in the storage ring. The greater part of these goods was either various kinds of ores or some demon beasts' materials. Basically, these were the relics of the obese Taoist man of the transcending heaven immortal cult who he had encountered before. Shi Mu had noticed that he had been left with only 1,000 or so spirit stones after he had made the payment for refining his black blade and stick. Therefore, he had decided to sort out the things in his hand. He wanted to replace some of the items that he wouldn't use with spirit stones. Suddenly, a burst of black smoke bubbled up in the room out of nowhere. Then, Yan Luo's silhouette gradually came into sight. Its whole body was covered with a white armor like before. In fact, even its head was covered with armor. Its body looked to be completely sealed up except for the 2 clusters of purple soul flames in its eyes. Shi Mu was dumbfounded to see Yan Luo standing before him. Yan Luo lifted one of its hands, and extended a green flower toward Shi Mu before he could speak anything. At the same time, the delightful and melodious voice of a young girl resounded in Shi Mu's head, "Lend me your stick. I don't have that stick right now. I have given it to a blacksmith for refining. It will take around 10 days to get it back. So, why don't you come again and pick it up at that time?" Shi Mu looked at the green flower, and a trace of happiness surged in his heart. So, he explained everything to Yan Luo with the help of his spirit sense. "Okay," Yan Luo replied. "How about you give this flower to me in advance? Is that possible?" Shi Mu asked in a tentative manner. "Okay," the soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes flashed as it replied. Shi Mu had barely held out his hand and received the green flower when Yan Luo suddenly found something. Its body flashed, and it appeared close to the pile of goods the next moment. Then, it bent down and picked up a blood-red order token from the pile. It was faintly emanating blood-red radiance. It was the Dark Moon Order token that Shi Mu had obtained from Deacon Chuan of Pai City. "Can you lend me this thing?" Yan Luo looked at that order token over and over again. Then, it said to Shi Mu with the help of its spirit sense. "There is no problem in giving it to you." Shi Mu didn't wait for Yan Luo to complete its words, and gave it a reply through his spirit sense. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes throbbed. It looked at Shi Mu, but didn't say anything again. It then received the blood-red token in its storage ring with a flash of grey qi. Then, its whole body got enveloped by a mass of black smoke, and it disappeared into the void. Shi Mu gazed at the remaining plumes of black smoke as they gradually dissipated. Then, he shook his head. He couldn't understand why some memories kept floating in his mind, such as the memories of those nights when he was on his way back to the Black Demon sect. He had made Yan Luo accompany him to practice in those nights. In addition, the memories of the time when he was in the Black Demon sect's cave mansion also floated in his mind. He had blurted out everything that was on the back of his mind in front of Yan Luo at that time. Yan Luo's intelligence had been very low in the beginning, so much so that it had only been able to express simple things. But, it had been much closer to Shi Mu at that time than it was now. Shi Mu had learned a lot of things about the soul magicians of the Dark Moon cult from his experiences over these days. So, he was very much aware of the processes used by the soul magicians to strengthen their spirit pets. He had also heard somewhere that it could easily take more than 10 years to promote the strength of the dead spirit creature by a small realm. Moreover, Yan Luo had only been an ordinary martial warrior in the beginning. However, it had ascended to an unimaginable level in less than 10 years. The crucial point was that Shi Mu had never taken the initiative to care about Yan Luo's practice from the beginning to this day. Yan Luo had relied entirely on itself to achieve such an incredible strength. Shi Mu was very curious to know the reason behind this. But, he knew deep in his heart that Yan Luo would never tell him anything. "I don't know whether the promotion of Yan Luo's strength is a blessing or a misfortune." Shi Mu mumbled to himself in a self-ridiculing manner. He then decided to cast this thought aside for the time being. After that, he received the green flower in the vast earth ring. Then, he got back to tidying up the things that were scattered in the room. Some time passed. Shi Mu had stored the stuff that he was prepared to sell in the golden ring, and the stuff that he still found useful in his vast earth ring. He sat down on his wooden bed after he had wrapped up this task. Then, he drew out the green flower, and plucked a petal off it in a careful manner. The petal crumbled, and changed into a mass of cold and gloomy green vapor. The green vapor then coiled around his right hand, and started to seep into his body in a slow manner. Half an hour passed. A strong magic power wave suddenly burst forth from Shi Mu's body, and took the shape of an invisible magic power whirlpool around his body. The magic power whirlpool submerged into his body after some time, as if it were a long whale. Shi Mu then opened his eyes, and a gleam of happiness glittered across his face. He sensed that the magic power within his body had escalated by leaps and bounds once again after he had absorbed the entire green flower. Also, he had made a breakthrough from the 12th stage of the art of accumulating spirit power, and had stepped into the 13th stage like he had always wished. Moreover, the shadow of a third star had brightened in the cluster of cloud inside his sea of consciousness. Chapter 282, Poches. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. There were two black mountains ranges under the dark and gloomy sky. They stretched over hundreds of miles, and were thousands of feet in height. They looked curved like the horns of a cow. They stood aloft opposite each other like two recumbent giants. Moreover, they had created a large and leveled valley in the middle. A plume of black smoke emerged in the void outside this valley. Then, Yan Luo's silhouette walked out of the smoke while holding the blood-red order token in its hand. The token was faintly emitting blood-red radiance. Yan Luo gazed at the token. Then, it turned its head and looked in the direction of the valley's entrance. The soul flame in its eyes flashed, and a large mass of black smoke enveloped its whole body. Then, a gust of cold wind blew, and Yan Luo's silhouette disappeared from the place. A huge sacrificial altar stood upright in the middle of the canyon. It was made of white bones of the dead. A grey smoke curled in the air around this altar. Then, waves of grey light started to wind around the surface of the 8 thick white bones on the peak of this altar. A few magic characters fluttered over the altar. They constituted a grand grey magic formula. After that, corpses began to emerge out of thin air inside this magic array. The corpses varied in sizes, shapes, and forms. Some of these corpses were of humans, while some were of demon beasts. These corpses were curled up in the grey smoke. The surface of their skin suddenly started to become dry and shriveled at a fast speed. And, they eventually turned into zombies. There were many corpses among them whose flesh had disappeared completely in this process, and they had ended up becoming skeletons. Feeble and pale green soul flames were flickering in the eyes of these newborn dead spirit creatures. They staggered to their feet, and went into the depths of the valley. Their goal was to reach the extensive deep water lake that was located in the depths of the canyon. Intermittent waves of faint red fog were curling on the faint red surface of the lake. The fog had been gradually drifting in the wind. Therefore, it had shrouded hundreds of feet in area by the lakeside over time. Naturally, the density of this fog increased with proximity to the lake. The indistinct shadows of numerous human skeletons, zombies, and other dead spirit creatures had gathered in the mist. Several dead spirit demon beasts were also among them. Their mouths opened and closed, as if they were swallowing the faint red mist. These dead spirit creatures had soul flames in their eyes that varied in color. Most of them had green and bluish-green soul flames. But, a small number of them also possessed blue soul flames. Their soul flames seemed to be getting darker than the others since they were relatively closer to the lake water. Only 3 lonesome silhouettes could be seen within the radius of 100 or more feet from the lake water. And, each one of them was at a considerable distance from each other. The silhouette that was nearest to the lake water was a crystal-like human skeleton. The bones of its whole body were transparent like a crystal. It was sitting cross-legged, and pale purple soul flames were gleaming in its eyes. There was a green bone wolf on the left side of the lake. It was approximately 10 feet in height. A purple-colored soul flame was flickering in its eyes. However, the aura around its body was much stronger than that of the crystal human skeleton. And, the third one was a gigantic zombie alligator. It lay prone on the right side of the lake. It was almost 50 or 60 feet long, and its whole body was covered with fist-sized thin black scales. Suddenly, a shadow flashed behind the crystal skeleton, and a silhouette came into view. Its whole body was covered with a suit of white armor. It was Yan Luo. The white bone spear in Yan Luo's hand turned fuzzy as soon as Yan Luo came into appearance. It seemed that the spear changed into a stream of white light as it got thrust toward the back of that crystal-like skeleton's head. The crystal-like skeleton turned around abruptly, and a cluster of green flames ignited in each of its hands. Then, it brought them together in front of its body. The two clusters of green flames merged into a massive and green human skeleton's head with a burst of strong magic power waves. Then, the skeleton's head opened and closed its mouth, as if it was trying to bite the tip of the bone spear. A vast stretched mass of green flames also gushed out of its mouth as this happened. And, it enveloped the bone spear the next moment. The bone spear started to burn under the scorching heat of the green flame. Moreover, a layer of green ice crystals started to form on its surface. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes throbbed as it saw this scene. Then, a layer of unusual white radiance started to flow on the surface of the bone spear in an uncertain manner. At the same time, some white magic characters appeared in the surrounding, and quickly changed into bursts of white flames. The green ice crystals shattered into small pieces with a crackling sound the next moment. The green flames that had enveloped the bone spear also melted away as soon as they came in contact with the white flames. The green human skeleton's head issued a wailing sound. Then, it burst and dispersed with a loud bang under the effect of the rolling white flames. After that, the bone spear that was covered in blazing white flames pierced the head of the crystal skeleton. The skeleton's head exploded with a loud rumbling sound, and a pale purple light ball floated into appearance. It got swept by an invisible suction force, and went into Yan Luo's mouth as soon as it appeared. Then, the headless crystal skeleton fell, and crashed near the shore of the deep water lake with a loud thud. But then, an incomparably thick black beam of light was shot out at a high speed. Dozens of curved moon-shaped green blade shadows were also shot out from a different direction at the same time. However, Yan Luo vanished from sight with the black smoke that was curling on its body. The numerous densely packed curved moon-shaped green blade shadows and the black beam of light swept over the place where Yan Luo had stood a moment ago, and ended up hitting in the air. Dozens of feet away on both sides, the green-colored bone wolf and the zombie alligator rushed in the direction of the crystal skeleton in a threatening manner. A magic image of a beast stood behind the green bone wolf. The beast had the body of a tiger and the head of a wolf. In addition, a massive shadow emerged above the head of the zombie alligator. The shape of that shadow resembled that of a gigantic crocodile. The soul flame in the zombie alligator's eyes throbbed at this moment, as if it had felt something. So, it abruptly turned around. The magic image behind it also turned around. Yan Luo's silhouette had appeared behind it amid a black smoke. Then, the bone spear in its hand got thrusted toward the alligator like a bolt of lightning. The alligator's magic image stretched open its big mouth and a black light flashed in it. After that, the black light changed into a mass of black vortex, and a thick black light beam was projected from the center of that vortex. The bone spear and the black light beam collided, and ended up in a deadlock. Yan Luo's soul flame flickered, and a streak of white light shot up to the sky behind it. Then, that white light transformed into the magic image of a gorgeous young girl. That girl was clad in an elegant white royal robe that fluttered behind her in a graceful manner. Then, a wonderful singing voice resounded, like melodious sounds of nature. After that, numerous pure white flower petals blotted out the whole sky, and began to float down in a gentle manner. The purple soul flame in the zombie alligator's eyes stagnated, and the black light beam that it had spouted disappeared into thin air. The bone spear in Yan Luo's hand somewhat loosened since it wanted to seize this opportunity, and stab the head of the zombie alligator below. However, something strange happened at this very moment. The surface of the deep water lake below suddenly split open. Then, a huge hatchet shadow which was curled up in scorching grey flames darted out with a seemingly inexhaustible force. It hacked at the top of Yan Luo's head at an alarming speed. Even the void that had come in contact with the hatchet shadow along the way had started to twist and distort. Yan Luo was startled to see this situation, and immediately withdrew the bone spear that it had thrust toward the zombie alligator. After that, a mass of black smoke erupted from its body, and its silhouette became fuzzy once again. Then, a whoosh sound was heard. The shadow of the huge hatchet had penetrated Yan Luo's body, and had cleaved it into two segments from head to toe. However, the two severed parts turned fuzzy and dissipated into thin air in an instant. The fact was that those two severed silhouettes were only Yan Luo's after-image. However, the hatchet shadow's momentum didn't decline. Instead, it continued to flash in the air, as if it could go directly to the horizon. It also continued to divide the billowing grey clouds in the air. Meanwhile, the faint red lake water below got cleaved at a fast speed. Then, a large monster emerged from the bottom of the lake. It was curled up in grey smoke. This fierce monster had the body of a human, and the head of an ox. Moreover, the lower half of its body seemed to be made of condensed black smoke. That monster held a gigantic white bone hatchet in its right hand. This bone hatchet was dozens of feet long. Shi Mu might have been profoundly shocked if he were here. After all, this monster was the same ox-headed monster that had gone berserk and brought calamity in the heavenly U-City at the time of that auction. However, he had eventually been defeated by Elder Taoist Wu Chen, the leader of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. This monster was none other than Demon King Luo Tian. A few years had passed since that incident in the heavenly U-City. Demon King Luo Tian seemed to have recovered some parts of his body over these years. The aura around him didn't seem to be as formidable as it used to be before. However, the coercive force of an earth-ranked powerhouse still existed in him. The zombie alligator and the green bone wolf received the magic images that were behind them as soon as the Demon King appeared before their eyes. Moreover, the soul's flames in their eyes started to tremble, as if the two were afraid of him. Numerous skeletons, zombies, and other dead spirit creatures that were around the lake were also shaken by the impact of an invisible yet formidable force. They then crouched on the ground in quick succession, as if their king had appeared before them. The Demon King Luo Tian fired his gaze around. It seemed as if he wanted to find Yan Luo. However, he was only making a futile effort. You came here and acted in a reckless manner. You dared to disturb my cultivation. I won't let you off the next time. Demon King Luo Tian's furious roar burst out in the air over the lake like a loud thundering sound. It made a long-range raid in all directions without showing the slightest sign of fading. The soul flames in the skeletons and zombies' eyes started to flicker endlessly. Their crouched bodies started to quiver out of fear. In the meantime, a world-shaking roar rang out. It sounded similar to roar of a tiger. The sound had originated from a place that was full of swamps with black bubbles and mud. It couldn't be said how far it was from the Black Canyon. The sky was densely covered with layers of dark clouds. And, those dark clouds started to converge to that place from all directions. Then, a frightening aura burst out from the swamp, and shrouded the whole swampland in an instant. Simultaneously, a grey fog pervaded the air over the swamps. Then, it started to roll in a certain order under the impact of this dreadful aura. Gradually, it took the shape of a gigantic vortex in the swampland. A huge silhouette gradually emerged in the center of the vortex. It was a white skull that was almost the size of an attic. Its appearance made it seem that it was a kind of tiger-class ominous beast. The soul flame that was gleaming in its eye sockets revealed a strange silver radiance. The gloomy corpse mountains. Inside a grand and green palace that was situated in the main altar of the Dark Moon cult. A curly-haired young man sat opposite a wide-mouthed middle-aged man. He was attired in a grey robe. There was a gloomy expression across his face at this moment. He was discussing something while sipping a fragrant tea. Suddenly, the wide-mouthed middle-aged man's complexion changed, and he stood up. The cup of tea in his hand got squeezed into powder with a ping sound. "What happened?" the curly-haired man asked. "My crystal skeleton met with an accident," the wide-mouthed middle-aged man replied in a sinking voice. "The crystal skeleton? Hadn't you stationed it near the cult's altar some time ago?" the curly-haired man asked. "Yes. The altar was going through serious issues at that time," the middle-aged man said. "Most of the palace lords wouldn't have recalled their spirit pets these days. They must have made their spirit pets to be on standby in the vicinity of the altar. In addition, we also have Demon King Luo Tian to stand on guard. So, the altar is unlikely to bump into any problems. Anyway, your crystal skeleton is an earth-rank spirit pet. So, it will be enough in case someone still dares to create any problem," the curly-haired man knitted his brows as he reassured. "It doesn't matter what you say. The connection between my spirit sense and the crystal skeleton has already been cut off. I must rush over to the dead spirit world as soon as possible so that I can investigate and find out the truth." "So, Palace Lord Huo takes his leave first," the middle-aged man with a wide mouth said. Then, he strode towards the door. In the dead spirit world, in the vicinity of the white bone altar in the Black Canyon. Bang! A rumbling sound was heard. A stream of white light plummeted down from midair at a very high speed. It seemed as if it was a bolt of lightning. It flashed and landed beside the white bone's altar. Then, a silver-grey human skeleton came into appearance. There was a pair of pale green soul flames in that silver-grey skeleton's eyes. But, they suddenly dissipated, and got replaced by two clusters of luminous pale purple soul flames. The skeleton's limbs had been shaking since it had appeared. However, they became agile all of a sudden. The silver-grey skeleton stood for a moment in the same place. After that, it started to walk towards the depths of the canyon along with the surrounding dead spirit creatures. Its pace had increased considerably in a short span of time after it had arrived before the deep water lake. The lake was still pervaded by the faint red mist like before. Also, the surrounding dead spirit creatures were still in the process of swallowing up the mist. The silver-grey skeleton didn't hesitate. It sprang up and crossed numerous dead spirit creatures in one fell swoop. It arrived at the bank of the lake, and swept its eyes around. The soul flame in its eyes trembled as it saw the corpse of a skeleton that lay down on the ground not far from it. The whole body of that skeleton was transparent like a crystal. But, its head had been badly crushed, so much so that the scene was difficult to withstand. Only a small part of its head was still connected to its neck's bone. There were no other traces of a battle on its entire body. These circumstances signified that the crystal skeleton must have been killed with a single strike. Chapter 283, An Accident. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. A few days later. In the reception hall of the Heavenly Wu Arms shop. Shi Mu's eyebrows were tightly knitted, and he seemed to be discussing something with Manager Tian. There was a cup of fragrant tea placed on the table beside him. But, the steam had dispersed by now. But, it seemed as if it hadn't been touched so far. I had never thought she would come to the ancient Xixia country. Manager Tian, can it be possible to pass her a message on my behalf? Shi Mu said after a momentary hesitation. Yes. You can give your message to Master Su. But, we will charge dear friend Mu 50% of the total price from before to settle this bill. And, that will be 500 spirit stones, Manager Tian said. Shi Mu didn't say anything again. He simply took out a letter from the vast earth ring, and handed it over to him along with 5 middle-grade spirit stones. Manager Tian extended his hand to receive them. The two exchanged a few words for a while. Afterwards, Manager Tian bid him farewell and departed. Shi Mu leaned on the back of a wooden chair, and closed his eyes in order to raise his spirit. However, a moment later, the voice of an old man spread from outside the door. Dear friend Mu, I'm very sorry to have kept your excellency waiting for so long. However, this old man had an important task to take care of, Su Lu rushed into the room through the door. But, he didn't take a seat. He walked straight toward Shi Mu. Master Su has a lot of work to do. So, waiting for you for some time is not a big deal. I just came here to ask about the progress of my weapons refinement assignment, Shi Mu asked. This is very hard to explain in words. Dear friend Mu will naturally understand it if he sees it with his own eyes. Su Lu's footsteps stagnated, and a hint of embarrassment flashed through his face as he said. Well, please lead the way, Master Su. Shi Mu's heart skipped a bit on hearing these words. He then said. Su Lu didn't drag the conversation further. He turned around, and walked toward the hall's exit door. The two men passed through the courtyards of several warehouses in a row. Then, they finally arrived before a courtyard that had been built with grey boulders. The courtyard's gate was wide open at this time. Plenty of iron-made materials were piled up inside in a neat and organized manner. In addition, several huge stone-made water tanks could also be seen inside. The courtyard seemed very crowded. A number of people were constantly moving around in it. Most of these people were sturdy and powerful men. The upper part of their bodies was bare. They held various kinds of materials or tools in their hands, and were frequently accessing various rooms. Su Lu went into the courtyard, and walked straight to a small and independent stone room. Shi Mu followed him closely. Simultaneously, he kept sweeping his eyes to examine the surrounding area. The entire body of this stone room had been made from a kind of light blue stone. Therefore, it looked special in the courtyard. Master Su. Master. Su Lu and Shi Mu bumped into many sturdy men on their way, and those men stopped to greet Master Su. Su Lu responded to them with a brief nod and a smile. Soon after, Su Lu and Shi Mu entered a stone room made of blue stone. This small and private fire room had a large stove placed in the middle. However, the temperature of the room surprised Shi Mu. The stone room should have been scorching hot since a faint red light could be seen in the fire of the stove. However, it wasn't even slightly hot. It seemed that a kind of high-ranked magic formula had been used to isolate the temperature of the room. There was a shiny black forging platform not far from the big stove. It was square in shape. In addition, there was also an iron-made weapons rack next to this forging platform. A long black blade and a short stick were placed on the shelf in addition to a long bone-white bow. The appearance of the bow looked almost same as before. There was also a pot of arrows beside the shelf. Those arrows had black feathered tails. There were approximate 20 such arrows in that pot. Dear friend Mu, why don't you take a look at this bow first? This old man has used the black-winged griffin's muscles to refine the string of this bow. Also, I've made 20 pieces of vulture-tailed arrows using the griffin's feathers. Su Lu took a few steps forward, and picked up the sky-splitting bow and the pot of black feathered arrows from the weapons rack. Then, he handed them over to Shi Mu. Shi Mu received them, and poured his gaze on them. He noticed that there were many spirit patterns engraved on the surface of the sky-splitting bow's body and wings. The bowstring had also changed beyond recognition. There were indeed 20 black feathered arrows in the pot. And, the tail feathers of these arrows had indeed been taken from the black-winged griffin's feathers. In addition, a circle of detailed magic characters had been engraved on the shafts of the arrows. The bow and the arrows were emanating bursts of strong magic power waves. The fact was that they had been upgraded into high-ranked magic tools after refinement. Shi Mu nodded with satisfaction. Then, a white light flashed in his hand, and the sky-splitting bow and the vulture-tailed arrows were received by him in his ring. Thank you so much, Master Su. Su Lu waved his hand. Then, he picked up the black blade and the short stick from the weapons rack, and handed them over to Shi Mu. Shi Mu put out his hand and received them. He felt that the weight of these two weapons hadn't changed by a big margin. However, their diameter had changed slightly from before. Presumably, it had happened because the impurities had been removed. Furthermore, the structure of the two weapons also hadn't changed much. In fact, they could still be joined together to form an 8-foot-long extended blade. However, Shi Mu couldn't shake off a kind of indescribable feeling that had welled up in his heart when he held the blade and the short stick. This made him recall the strange behavior that Su Lu had shown a moment ago. He then examined the weapons once again in a careful manner, and discovered an anomaly. He noticed that the black blade and the short stick hadn't been engraved with any magic formulas. Shi Mu raised his head, and looked at Su Lu with a dubious look on his face. But, Su Lu immediately took the initiative to give a proper explanation to him before he could open his mouth to speak anything. "Dear friend Mu, I'm embarrassed to speak about this matter. Actually, this old man had taken utmost care, but Su Lu had refined these two weapons to remove the impurities. After that, his plan had been to send people to inscribe magic spells on these two weapons. However, the hardness of the two weapons had increased very insanely after the purification process. He had then used all kinds of methods, both conventional and unconventional, to inscribe magic spells on the weapons. But, all of his efforts had ended in vain. In fact, those methods hadn't been able to leave even a little trace on the weapons. Master Su, do you mean to say that there's no possibility to develop these two weapons into magic tools anymore?" Shi Mu's brows creased as he asked. "That's right." Su Lu's face got suffused with an apologetic look, and he nodded in agreement. After that, a ray of light flashed in Su Lu's hand, and a bag full of spirit stones appeared in it. This was the same bag that Shi Mu had given him as payment for this task. Su Lu then handed the bag over to Shi Mu. "Dear friend Mu, this old man has committed a mistake. This old man has failed to achieve the result that he had promised. Therefore, I have no other choice but to return the reward money to you," Su Lu said with a soft sigh. "I wonder whether Master Su will allow me to use his fire room for some time." Shi Mu received the spirit stones. Then, he abruptly asked. "Of course you can." Su Lu was surprised to hear his request. But then, he nodded and explained the way of using the fire room in detail. Su Lu left after he had explained everything. After that, Shi Mu flipped his palm, and a porcelain bottle appeared in his hand. The bottle contained the remaining venom of the golden lizard. Then, he looked at the forging platform with his brows slightly creased, and a hint of nervousness bubbled up in his heart. In the official meeting hall that was situated in the dark shrine of the Dark Moon cult's main altar, the spacious stone chairs of the 10 palace lords were fully occupied except for 2 seats Luan's and the wide-mouthed middle-aged man's. "Where are Palace Lord Lu and Palace Lord Tang?" the white-haired old man asked. He was seated on the right-hand side of the seat of honor. His face looked a lot older than it was a few days ago. The deep ditches on his face that were densely covered with wrinkles looked even more noticeable at this moment. "Respected right-wing minister, Palace Lord Tang's spirit pet the crystal skeleton had an accident near the altar of the dead spirit world. Therefore, he has rushed to the dead spirit world to find the murderer. As for Palace Lord Lu, I don't have any concrete information about him." Huo Qing, the curly-haired young man said. "It doesn't matter where they are. I presume that everyone has heard about the past 2 days' matters. The specific details of the situation will be recounted by one of the palace lords who has just returned from the front line," right-wing minister said while casting his gaze at a man on his left side. That man had a knife-cut scar on his face. There was a trace of exhaustion on that man's face at this moment. "Everyone, Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and Heavenly Demon Sect have entered the Wei Country and Chen Country respectively in these past 2 days. Eastern Woods and Linhai provinces in the southeast and Black River province in the northeast have been captured by them in the span of a day and a night. The people of these 2 sects have also mounted full-on attack on the towns and cities. They have left a small number of disciples behind to take care of these matters. And, the rest of the troops have continued to travel day and night to approach the western region as soon as possible. I'm afraid that their soldiers will reach the city within 1 month if they continue to forge ahead at such a pace." The scar-faced man gave a brief nod to greet everyone. Then, his hoarse voice resounded in the hall. A sense of gloominess pervaded the entire hall the moment he made his report. Everyone was trying to digest the news they had just heard. Everyone is now aware of the present situation. So, Palace Lords, you are free to put forth your ideas, the white-haired old man said. Almost all the disciples who had been selected in the preliminary selection competition for the sea trip have arrived here. So, Luan's plan to embark on the journey can be executed if the boats are in position, the royally dressed young woman said after a moment of silence. Palace Lord Sun, may I venture to ask the whereabouts of those ships? Palace Lord Lu hasn't showed up yet. I'm afraid that he might not have gotten hold of those ships yet. Huo Qing snorted. Palace Lord of the Dark Green Wolf Palace, your words don't sound fair and reasonable. We all know that Palace Lord Lu had asked for 2 months of time when he had taken an oath before us. However, only half a month has passed since then. Di Feng, the man with red eyebrows, said in a reprimanding tone. That is indeed true. However, the war seems to be on verge of erupting. We may be ready to wait for the ships for 2 months. But, do you think the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and Heavenly Demon Sect will give us the time? It seems to me that our main altar will have been encircled by the enemy by the time Palace Lord Lu arranges those ships. What would be the use of those ships then? To load the corpses. Huo Qing sneered. You, Di Feng was infuriated for a moment. Right-wing minister and my fellow palace lords, I had some important matter to deal with. So, I couldn't mark my presence on time. I hope for your forgiveness. An air of reluctance to comprise had permeated the palace hall when Luan's voice spread from the outside. Luan walked into the hall in a calm manner. He was still clad in a pale white long robe. He then made a respectful gesture to greet the white-haired old man. After that, he stood still in the same place. Palace Lord Lu, you are late for such an important meeting. Can it be possible that you had gone to receive the delivery of your 20 ships? Huo Qing sneered. Yes. Exactly, Luan replied with a smile. The people in the hall were left stunned as soon as this statement was made. They were pleasantly surprised on hearing Luan's reply. Good. The white-haired old man's eyes brimmed with exultation, and he immediately got up in excitement. He couldn't stop himself from appreciating Luan for his splendid work. How can it be possible? Huo Qing said. It seemed as if he didn't want to believe Luan's words. Everyone, this is a matter of life and death for our cult. So, I would request you to take a step, and follow me to the seacoast to see the truth with your own eyes, Luan put on a mild smile as he said. The people naturally didn't have any objection to Luan's proposal. Half an hour later, a crowd of high-ranked figures of the Dark Moon cult had assembled somewhere on an uninhabited and remote shore of the Yellow Sea outside Chuyang City. Palace Lord Luan, let's see your ships now. Huo Qing said. Other people in the surrounding also cast a hopeful look at Luan. Luan didn't speak anything. But, a ray of light suddenly flashed in his hands, and a square-headed mini-seaboat emerged out of nowhere. It had a squared tail as well. The boat's whole body was engraved with numerous exquisite magic characters, which appeared exceptionally mysterious. Then, an unusually strong wave of spirit power spread from it. Surprisingly, it was the formidable aura of a spirit tool. Yes, it's the gigantic vast sea boat. Right-wing minister said while nodding. Luan didn't speak anything. He simply poured his magic power into the mini-sea boat in his hand, and then tossed it in the air. The mini-sea boat got wrapped up in a cloud of grey chi, and slowly landed on the surface of the sea. Then, the miniature sea boat's whole body gleamed with a splendid brilliance, and started to expand at a visibly fast speed. Eventually, a massive black ship appeared on the sea's surface. The square-tailed ship's entire body had been painted with all kinds of magic characters and patterns. This ship was 500 feet in length, over 100 feet in width, and nearly 40 or 50 feet in height. It seemed as if a majestic hill was floating on the sea surface. Also, there were 2 rows of pitch-black square-shaped muzzles on its side strings. And, those muzzles were covered with fencing wood. The main body of the ship was a 5-storied garret that had an aura of antiquity. The rear area of the garret had a large main mast. Also, 100 or more feet tall huge sail was hung on the mast. A miraculous glow was flickering on the surface of the sail. Luan kept his right hand in the same manner for some time, and a ray of light continued to flash in it. Simultaneously, gigantic vast sea boats continued to appear near the seacoast. 20 gigantic vast sea boats had appeared before everyone's eyes. They were parked on the seashore in a row. It seemed as if a large dark cloud had descended to the surface of the sea. How could it be? Huo Qing was left stunned as he saw this scene. The remaining people including Difeng clicked their tongues in Luan's appreciation. They couldn't help but feel a surge of reverence for Luan as they gazed into his eyes. They had 20 gigantic vast sea boats at their disposal now. So, they could relocate a large number of their cult's elite disciples to the western continent at any time. Good. Palace Lord Lu indeed doesn't renege on his promises. However, we mustn't waste any time. Let's work together to execute Palace Lord Liu's plan now. Transmit an order to impose a curfew throughout the city. All war-related news must be sealed off. Also, no one is allowed to leave the city. Right-wing minister commanded. Chapter 284, begins ahead of time. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. 1 hour later, in the branch stronghold of the Dark Moon cult. Shi Mu sat by the side of a wooden table. He looked at the black blade and the short stick in his hands, and a wry smile loomed on his face. The fact was that he had gone a few rounds of trials, but he had found that the golden lizard's venom didn't respond to his present meteoric iron black blade and stick. It couldn't be denied that these 2 weapons had become very formidable after refinement, so much so that they could destroy the hardest of defenses. However, their strength had reduced since they didn't allow the inscription of magic spells on them. Shi Mu was trying to decide whether he should go ahead and purchase the 2 high-ranked hilted weapons when a puff of black smoke had suddenly appeared in front of him along with Yan Luo's silhouette. Then, a girl's melodious voice had resounded in his mind. "Lend me your stick." There's some issue with this stick." Shi Mu hesitated for a moment. Then, he replied. The purple soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes flashed as if it didn't understand the meaning of Shi Mu's words. "The magic formula that was engraved on the surface of this stick is gone. So, it's no longer a magic tool." Shi Mu explained. "It doesn't matter. Just give me the stick." "Yan Luo, are you?" Shi Mu's heart skipped a beat and he asked. Shi Mu couldn't help but recall the first time Yan Luo had appeared to borrow this meteoric iron black stick. However, a gust of wind swept over and the black stick disappeared from Shi Mu's hand before he could finish his sentence. Shi Mu raised his head, only to find that Yan Luo was holding the black stick before its eyes, and was examining it. Shi Mu hadn't seen Yan Luo making any action, but a layer of crow-like black radiance had appeared on the surface of the black stick in Yan Luo's hand. The black light then permeated the air, and made the void look as if it was twisting and distorting. Then, the black light disappeared and everything returned to normal, as if everything had only been an illusion. Shi Mu stared at the black stick. He had been dumbfounded. The fact was that he had clearly sensed the presence of a strong aura when the black light had appeared a moment ago. Also, that aura's strength was far beyond the strength of his own golden sword. And, the spirit stones. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes flickered. Apparently, it was satisfied with the black stick in its hand. It then said again. Shi Mu seemed to have expected this. So, he drew out a bag containing 1,000 spirit stones from the vast earth ring, and threw it to Yan Luo. "More? How many?" "4 more bags." The corner of Shi Mu's eyes twitched as he heard its reply. The bag he had thrown had contained 1,000 spirit stones. So, 5 such bags would be equivalent to 5,000 spirit stones. Shi Mu thus thought that Yan Luo must have asked in a casual manner. You are giving it or not? Okay, I'll give them to you, but on one condition. You'll have to tell me a few things first. Do you know this kind of meteoric iron material? Also, how did you consume the spiritual energy of this stick, almost to the extent of its exhaustion? Shi Mu asked 2 questions in one breath. This. I don't know. I only know that this touch is very familiar to me. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes throbbed as it replied while rubbing the black stick with its hand. Shi Mu hesitated a bit when he heard its reply. But, he still kept his promise. He took out 4 bags of spirit stones, and tossed them toward Yan Luo. Yan Luo stretched out its hands, and received the bags. After that, a mass of black smoke welled up on the surface of its body. And, Yan Luo disappeared into the void the next moment. Shi Mu stared at the black blade in his hand in blank dismay after Yan Luo's departure. A trace of gloomy and uncertain expression clouded his face. It seemed from Yan Luo's words that Yan Luo must have unified its ability to absorb the spiritual aura of the stick to increase its performance. The quality of this kind of meteoric iron should be rather extraordinary. Otherwise, why would Yan Luo show up here to borrow this stick even though the extent of its present strength was uncertain? A hint of excitement sprouted in Shi Mu's heart as this thought crossed his mind. And, he felt a sudden urge to restart his research. So, he held up the black blade to examine it all over again. He spent the entire day on it, and tried many methods. But, none of them fetched any fruitful result. Consequently, Shi Mu had no option but to give up for the time being. However, a seed of curiosity had been planted in his heart when it came to this black blade. Moreover, the thought of going out to buy a magic tool had been dispelled in light of this. Shi Mu continued to lock himself in the room for the next 2 days. He kept on drawing magic charms with an intention of exchanging them for spirit stones. He wanted to take advantage of the upsurge before the competition to sell his magic charms at a higher price. But then, the main altar of the Dark Moon cult issued a notice in the evening of the 2nd day. As per the notice, the competition had been scheduled to be conducted ahead of time. Also, it would mark its official commencement in the morning of the 2nd day from today. On the 2nd day, Shi Mu and the other people gathered at the crack of dawn. Then, they left the stronghold under the leadership of one of the cult's deacons. Ho Sai Lei also rushed over early in the morning, and then followed Shi Mu. He had done so since he had received a message from Shi Mu yesterday. Nobody was wandering in the city at this point of time. The Dark Moon cult had shifted the date of competition to an earlier date, but it seemed that they hadn't made any public announcements in this regard so far. Shi Mu and the other people gradually converged with other teams while walking along the streets. It didn't take long before the participating disciples had converged into a mighty stream of people. Then, they advanced towards the western region of the city in a silent manner under the guidance of their respective deacons. The venue of the competition didn't seem to be spread in the city as it had been the last time. And, the crowd was taken to a very large area in the west of Qiang City after a while. This place looked like a venue of an athletics tournament. This venue was exceptionally large. There was a huge open-air arena in the middle. It was surrounded by seats for the audience. But, it looked a bit shabby, as if it hadn't been renovated in a long time. A person taking a broad view of the site would notice that this arena seemed to be several miles in scope. The 10,000 or more winners from the first round of competition stood in the arena at this moment. However, the arena still didn't appear crowded by any means. Shi Mu stood in a corner of the arena, and looked toward the sky. The sky looked as cloudy as always. Shi Mu's brows slightly creased. He didn't know why he was feeling uneasy since the morning. Ho Sai Lei also stood beside him in a silent manner. However, there was no sign of Cai in the vicinity. "Brother Mu," a voice was heard. Then, Yu Yi walked over with a smiling face. 2 more people could be seen behind him. One of them was a young man with date-like red complexion. And, the other was a young woman. She was clad in a long pale green gown. She had a tall stature, but her appearance looked ordinary. Shi Mu's eyes swept over these two people as he waved his hand to greet Yu Yi. Brother Mu, it seems that you haven't left your room in the last few days. Could it be that you were absorbed in drawing magic charms behind the doors? Yu Yi asked with a smile. His mannerism was even more enthusiastic than before. Moreover, it was also suffused with a hint of implied flattery. Shi Mu had bumped into Yu Yi when he had gone to sell the magic charms. And, Yu Yi had become all the more enthusiastic toward Shi Mu when he had found out that Shi Mu was a charm magician. He, I had been running short of money. So, it was a necessity to earn some spirit stones, Shi Mu replied with a soft chuckle. Yu Yi smiled back. Then, his eyes drew toward Hosai Lei who stood aside. This fellow friend looks somewhat unfamiliar to me. May I know who he is? This is my friend, Hosai Lei. And, this is my dear friend, Yu Yi. Shi Mu introduced them to each other. So, you are friend Yu Yi. I'm pleased to meet you, Hosai Lei cupped his hands and greeted him. Yu Yi also cupped his hands, and exchanged pleasantries. After that, he introduced the two people beside him to Shi Mu. Both of them were magicians. The red-faced young man's surname was Luo, and his cultivation was at the initial stage of the star-ranked magician's realm. And, the surname of the green-dressed young woman was Yi. She was at the peak of the spirit-ranked magician's realm. Shi Mu and Hosai Lei greeted them in a brief manner. Neither of them seemed overly interested in Shi Mu since he had deliberately suppressed his aura to the spirit rank. Therefore, the two only greeted Shi Mu and Hosai Lei in a customary manner. Brother Yu, you are well informed. Do you know any details about today's competition? Shi Mu asked. I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't heard any useful news until now, even though I have inquired about this matter in every possible way. It seems that our cult has become very strict in this regard, Yu Yi shook his head as he replied. Then, let's wait and watch. Shi Mu nodded while sweeping his gaze around. There wasn't a single person in the central auditorium near the venue. Only a few disciples of the Dark Moon cult stood in front of a certain dome-shaped building. In that dome-shaped building, Luan stood with his hands crossed behind his back. There was a dignified look on his face. His junior female apprentice, the red-dressed girl, also stood beside him. Big brother, how is it possible that Demon King Luo Tian is lying severely injured in the cult's altar? The red-dressed girl asked. This incident seems somewhat strange. According to the information that I've received, a fellow whose whole body was covered with a white armor has inflicted this injury to him. And, it's the same fellow who had mounted a sneak attack on Palace Lord Tang's spirit pet, that crystal skeleton. The Demon King Luo Tian's strength hasn't recovered yet. The Demon King would have died instead of getting severely injured if not for Palace Lord Tang's vengeance that had driven him to block the attack aimed at the Demon King, Luan replied in a calm manner. The war seems to be on the verge of erupting. And Palace Lord Tang has died untimely. Indeed, misfortune never comes alone. The red-dressed girl let out a soft sigh. Suddenly, the door got pushed open, and the red-browed Difeng walked in. How's the situation? Luan asked. The situation is far from good. The attacks of the Heavenly Demon Sect and the Transcending Heaven Immortal Sect have become increasingly ferocious. They have already infiltrated deep into the central region of our Xixia country. I am afraid their soldiers will reach Qiang City in no time if this continues. Difeng's red eyebrows furrowed as he gave an explanation. Where are the right-wing minister and the other people? Luan asked. Respected senior has told you to not get distracted. Everything will be carried out according to the original plan. He has personally taken the charge of guarding the main altar. And, Huo Qing and the others have proceeded to the west coast, Difeng replied. Brother Di, you will make arrangements for a while. The people who win in this round will be forthwith escorted to the seacoast. They will then board the ship in proper sequence. And, the ship will embark on a journey as soon as it gets filled to its maximum limit, Luan thought for a second before he said. And, what about the people who will get defeated? Difeng asked after a momentary hesitation. Some of them will be brought back to the main altar, while some will be left in Qiang City. Let them buy some time for the people who are going to set out on this sea trip. Luan replied in a calm manner, but there was a cold and detached look in his eyes. Difeng looked into Luan's eyes, and felt a slight chill in his heart. He then nodded in response. Difeng then turned his head, and glanced at the people outside the venue. The corners of his mouth slightly moved, as if he wanted to say something. But, he couldn't bring himself to speak his mind. It's almost time. So, let's get started, Luan stated and took a step to walk toward the hall's exit door. Difeng and the red-dressed girl complied with his sound, and followed him closely. The three people walked over to a stage. The people below the stage quieted down, and cast their gaze at the three silhouettes on the stage. Shi Mu was also among this crowd. His eyes flickered as he saw Luan on the stage. Shi Mu had gathered some basic information about Luan's identity during the past few days. Therefore, he wasn't surprised to see him here today. People of our cult, we will conduct the second round of the competition here today, Luan made an announcement in a crisp and sonorous voice. His words had barely faded when the droning sound of people's discussion started to ring in the venue. They had an excited look on their faces. The matches will begin shortly. But, allow me to announce a matter first. Those people among you who have broken through the middle stage of star rank or have reached the middle stage of Xian realm don't need to participate in this round of matches. They can go directly to the third round of the competition after they've gotten their cultivation examined by the specialist, Luan continued. The audience broke into clamor as soon as this statement was made. This, Hosai Lei's eyes went wide open, and his face revealed a stunned look. Yu Yi and the other three people also revealed a look of disbelief on their faces. Shi Mu looked at Luan and the other people on the stage, and his eyebrows wrinkled. There were some people in the crowd at the moment that fulfilled this condition. So, they got overwhelmed with excitement. Simultaneously, they started to rush out of the crowd, and moved away from the ring one after another. Then, they were led to a building near Luan by the Dark Moon cult's people. Hosai Lei looked at Shi Mu since he knew that Shi Mu's martial arts cultivation had already reached the middle stage of Xian realm. There was a calm and unperturbed look on Shi Mu's face. Suddenly, a thought streaked across Shi Mu's mind, and his body stopped abruptly even though it was in motion. Chapter 285, Strange Rules. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Whether it was the middle stage of the Star Realm or the Xian realm, it was considered a splendid attainment in the Dark Moon cult. In fact, many of the deacons that held various positions in the subaltars were at this rank. Therefore, there were only a small number of people who walked out of the arena, roughly 500 or 600 people. The strength of these people was formidable. Therefore, the rest of the people in the arena didn't say anything in objection. On the contrary, some people secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Yu Yi was only at the primary stage of the Star Realm. Therefore, he was in the same boat as Hosai Lei. So, both of them also stayed back in the arena. Well, the remaining people will start with the second round of the competition. I would request everyone to receive the magic helmets from the managing disciples, and put them on. I will announce the concrete rules of the competition later on. Luan noticed that the flow of the disciples that were walking out of the crowd had stopped. So, he continued with his announcement. His voice had barely faded when dozens of Dark Moon cult's disciples who stood in the vicinity of the arena walked out. They carried baskets that contained silver-grey helmets. The helmets were made of metal. They stood erect, and had an appearance of a triangular barrel. They were awfully ugly. In fact, they looked like a clown's hat. Shi Mu and the others looked at each other in blank dismay. But then, they walked over and collected their hats. Shi Mu examined the hat for a moment, and the corners of his mouth curled into a grin. Then, he put it on his head. The next moment, a ray of light flowed on the surface of that hat, and a number emerged therein, 1052. He didn't notice any other peculiarity apart from this. Not even a trace of his magic power fluctuated in response. Perhaps, it was no better than an ordinary hat. However, an idea crossed his mind, and he instilled his spirit sense into the hat to explore it. Buzz! It seemed that his spirit sense had stimulated some kind of mechanism as the hat slightly vibrated in response. Then, the number on the hat lit up, and radiated a burst of red light. Another number also emerged in Shi Mu's mind for some inexplicable reason. 430. Most of the people in his surrounding had also worn their hats by this time. And, their hats had similarly started to brighten up one by one. Soon, the entire arena had been pervaded by an intense red radiance. The rules of this round of competition are very simple. All of you have already illuminated your hats. You must have also sensed the target number that your hat contains with the help of your spirit sense by now. You have to snatch away the hat that contains your target number in this round of the competition. However, you will be disqualified in case your own hat is shot off by your opponent before you seize hold of his hat. And, the person who is wearing the hat with your target number will be promoted to the next round. Basically, you will be promoted to the next round if you either snatch away your target's hat, or shoot off the hat of the person who is trying to snatch your hat. In addition, it is strictly prohibited to use a heavy hand in the battle. You aren't allowed to hit others or inflict severe injuries on them in this round. You will be disqualified from this competition if you break this rule, and the person who is wearing the hat with your target number will be promoted to the next round instead. Luan's voice resounded in the arena. Luan's voice had barely faded when it sparked off an uproar in the arena. Such a tumultuous situation hadn't erupted only because of the bizarre rules of the competition. The strict prohibition to hurt each other in this round had also contributed to the situation. The Dark Moon cult had held competitions in the past in order to determine the distribution of the cult's resources. However, there hadn't been such odd rules in those competitions. The rules that prohibited killing in the competition had often been seen at various places. However, a competition that prohibited participants from inflicting physical injuries on their opponents couldn't be seen anywhere in the world. Luan swept his gaze over the crowd under the stage, and waited for a moment. He wanted to give the people enough time to mentally process the rules that he had announced. It seems that everyone has understood the rules of this round. The second round of competition begins now. Luan made an announcement in a loud voice. The people in the arena tensed up and confronted each other as soon as this statement was made. They also started to distance themselves from the people around them. Bang! Some of the people in the arena had already moved into action. They had apparently caught sight of their target hats. Shi Mu and the four people near him exchanged looks with each other as a trace of caution floated in their eyes. Shi Mu distanced himself from Mu Yi and his two friends, and retreated toward Hosai Lei's side. What's your target number? Shi Mu's lips moved to ask Hosai Lei. It's 2067. Senior Mu can take away my hat if it has Senior's target number. Hosai Lei replied. No, you're not my target number. Shi Mu nodded since he had realized that there was no chance that an unwanted circumstance would emerge between the two men. He then told Hosai Lei his own target number. Brother Shi, Brother Ho, you don't have to be so alert. There are thousands of people in the arena at this moment. So, it's highly unlikely to have a place of coincidence in our small group of 4 or 5 people. My target is 3605, Yu Yi promptly said while looking at the red-faced man and the young woman beside him. The two people understood his implied meaning, and reported their own target numbers. They exchanged a few words, and soon found that there was indeed no such coincidence in their group. Each person had received a different goal. We know that the rules of this round are rather unusual. So, we'll most likely fail to attain our respective goals single-handedly. The one-man action approach will definitely lead to a very disadvantageous situation. So, Wouldn't it be better if the 5 of us were to join forces to deal with the current situation? Yu Yi put forth a proposal. Hosai Lei didn't speak anything, but he looked at Shi Mu in a manner that made it seem that he had blind trust in Shi Mu. All right. The 5 of us will work together since Brother Yu has come up with this invitation, Shi Mu considered for a moment. Then, he nodded in agreement. That's wonderful. Yu Yi was overjoyed. The 5 people reached an agreement soon after. They agreed that they must wait until everyone has obtained their respective target hat. After that, they would leave together. First of all, let's move to the periphery of the arena so as to avoid being attacked by the enemy, Shi Mu said. The other people got his point, and the 5 people immediately made a formation. Then, they moved towards the edge of the arena while watching each other's back. The 5 people were advancing towards the edge of the arena. Simultaneously, they were sweeping their gaze around in order to look for their own goals. There were a large number of people in the arena. In fact, there were over 10,000 people present on the scene. Therefore, the scene appeared awfully chaotic, so much so that it could almost dazzle a person's eyes. So, it was practically impossible for them to find their targets in this chaos. But, it could be clearly seen that many people had started to stick together like Shi Mu and his friends. Suddenly, a multicolored parrot flew over near the arena at this time. It couldn't be said from where it had arrived. It had stopped near the periphery. It was Cai. Cai had a panoramic view of the whole venue from his angle. A trace of white light glinted in Cai's eyes as he directed his gaze toward the arena. A moment later. I found him. Shi Mu's eyes brightened up since he had found his goal in a matter of seconds with the help of Cai's shared vision ability. That person was a young magician who appeared to be in his early 20s. However, he was considerably far from Shi Mu at the moment. In addition, Shi Mu also found Hosai Lei's goal after a few moments. Hosai Lei's target was close to his own target. He was a martial artist who held a scarlet machete. He was seemingly a Xian primary stage warrior from the looks of it. I've found my as well as Brother Ho's goal. Brother Yu, what about you? Shi Mu asked. Shi Mu's words left Yu Yi and his 2 friends profoundly shocked. However, Hosai Lei beamed with happiness on hearing his words. Not yet. However, the location of Brother Mu's goal has already been determined. So, we will postpone this step, and lend a hand to Brother Mu to take hold of his target hat first, Yu Yi said. There's no hurry. I'll help you 3 to find the location of your respective target first, Shi Mu shook his head as he replied. Shi Mu glanced at Luan who was still on the stage. Then, he lowered the brim of his hat, and raised his collar to cover half of his face. Afterwards, he sucked in a long and deep breath, and a gleam of golden radiance emerged in his eyes. The golden gleam looked miraculous as he swept his gaze into the surrounding. Brother Mu possesses awe-inspiring eyesight. It's truly commendable. Yu Yi's complexion changed as he saw Shi Mu's eye. He then said. Shi Mu smiled and didn't deny it. He then started to move his eyes once again. I found one. He isn't far from here. He is dear friend Luo's goal. Shi Mu's brows furrowed, and he said while pointing his finger in a particular direction after a few breaths. The red-faced man got overwhelmed with exultation as he heard this. He cast a glance at Shi Mu with deep gratitude. Let's go and capture this one first, Shi Mu said. The other people naturally didn't have any objection to this. They rushed and approached the red-faced man's target very quickly. This person was a 30-year-old man with a dragon-like mustache. He held a wooden stick in his hand. It was made of red rattan. This man didn't seem to have joined hands with anyone. He had stuck close to the edge of the arena, and was walking forward in a very cautious manner while sweeping his vision around. It seemed as if he was also trying to look for his own goal. Suddenly, the mustached man turned around, and saw that Shi Mu and his companions had swooped towards him. Consequently, his complexion changed terribly. The man couldn't think of a plan, and hence broke into a run in desperation. Two virtual star shadows emerged behind his head with a flash of light as this happened. Then, he waved the red rattan wooden stick, and a red light glinted in the air. After that, a few 7 or 8 5 feet long fiery snakes emerged in the air, and dashed towards Shi Mu and his companions while issuing whistling sounds. These fiery snakes intertwined in midair, and transformed into an expansive scalding fiery wave the next moment. The fiery wave surged up in a violent manner, and swept towards these people in order to engulf them. It almost seemed that these people would be devoured by the fervent wave in a couple of seconds. Shi Mu's eyes flashed, as if he was about to make a move. But then, the ground issued a loud thundering sound, and started to quiver. After that, a few feet thick and a few feet tall earthen wall emerged in front of these 5 people to block the fiery waves. It was Yu Yi who had casted this spell. His hands were pressed against the ground, and a layer of yellow luminescence had emerged on the surface of his body. Bang! The billowing fiery waves bombarded the earthen wall, and sent out a series of loud rumbling sounds. And, the fiery waves turned into a scorching mist which proliferated in all directions. The earthen wall vibrated for a few moments, as if it was on the brink of collapse. But, it had succeeded in warding off the fiery snake technique. The people in the vicinity drew back to the side in order to avoid getting affected by the scorching fiery mist. Suddenly, Shi Mu's silhouette flashed past the side of the earthen wall, and passed through the fervent mist. Simultaneously, he read an incantation and waved his hand. A streak of white light darted from his hand, and caught up with the mustached man as he was trying to flee. Then, it turned into a white chi chain, and bundled him on the spot. The mustached man shouted at the top of his voice. Then, he turned around and tumbled to the ground. He was trying to struggle to his feet when he saw that an ice-cold blade edge had been placed on his neck. The mustached man looked at the young man in front of him. This young man held a black blade in his hand. However, the mustached man let out a sigh, and chose to quit the fight. Then, the red-faced man rushed over and snatched away the hat from the grey-robed man's head. His red face brimmed with overwhelming excitement. "Brother Yu and Brother Mu, thank you so much." The red-faced young man looked at Shi Mu and Yu Yi and said with gratitude, "Let's go." Shi Mu waved his hand, and lowered his hat's brim a bit. He then quickly walked to the other side since he wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible. The fact was that he had just felt that he was being stared at by someone on the stage. Yu Yi and the other people couldn't understand the reason why Shi Mu was in a hurry to leave this place. But, they still followed him at a quick pace. On the stage, Luan looked toward a certain place in the arena under the stage, and a strange gleam flashed across his eyes. "What's wrong?" The red-dressed girl beside him noticed the sudden change in Luan's expressions, and asked. "Nothing," Luan replied. But, a faint smile was gleaming across Luan's face at the moment. The red-dressed girl felt a little surprised as she noticed this. The fact was that she hadn't seen him smile since they had returned. Her gaze followed Luan's line of sight, but she didn't find anything strange. "Brother Di, I'm giving you the charge of this place. Sister Zhen, let's go," Luan said to Di Feng. After that, he walked towards the dome-shaped building at the back along with the red-dressed girl. Chapter 286, Strange Absorption Ability. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. In the arena, Shi Mu stopped only after he had reached hundreds of feet away from the previous spot. He then looked towards the stage only to find that Luan was no longer there. This made him heave a sigh of relief. Shi Mu knew only a few pages of Luan's life so far. Even so, he had an intuition deep in his heart that this man was very dangerous. In addition, he had a gut feeling that Luan's strength wasn't as simple as it looked on the surface. He felt so because of his experience in the Heavenly U City's auction. Moreover, Shi Mu had realized something after he had thought about that matter meticulously. He had realized that he had been deliberately made incapable of severing ties with this man in an inexplicably clever manner. And, this had been accomplished by having the two major sects issue an order for his arrest. Luan had previously tried to recruit Shi Mu in his cult. However, Shi Mu had been reluctant to join the Dark Moon cult since he had wanted to stay far away from this Luan. "I'm going to the Western continent. I think I shouldn't bump into him again afterwards," Shi Mu thought so. "Brother Mu, what are you looking at?" Yu Yi and the other people had also walked over by now. "Nothing," Shi Mu retracted his gaze. Many of the people in the arena had found their targets by this time. Therefore, many battles had sprung up in this previously peaceful arena. Sounds of people fighting were constantly ringing from all directions, so much so that the scene had become increasingly chaotic. However, the participants had been confined by the rules of the competition. So, they weren't allowed to use a heavy hand to injure others. Consequently, very intense conflicts hadn't burst out in the arena so far. "Let's go and find the next target." It seemed that Shi Mu had become the leader of this group of 5 people by now. His cursory glance swept around the arena once. Then, he walked forward along with the other 4 people. The competition became even fiercer with time. Some people had been able to seize their target hats with great difficulty since they had only relied on their sheer strength. However, some people had been clever enough to snatch away their target hats skillfully by using other ways. There were also some people who had used the exchange of interest way to obtain their target hats. They had simply exchanged the hats that they wore with each other. Moreover, it seemed that the Dark Moon cult's managing disciples that had been stationed around the arena didn't prevent them from doing so. Nearly 2,000 people had already left the arena even though only half an hour had passed since the beginning of this competition. Less than half of these people had turned out successful in seizing hats. This was because some of them had inadvertently violated the competition rules, and had been led to a nearby building by the Dark Moon cult's managing disciples who stood under the platform. The disciples who had lost in the competition had also been taken away along with the rule-breaking disciples. Bang! A loud crashing sound was heard since a black-dressed man was struck and sent flying. Then, he crashed to the ground heavily with a loud sound. That man didn't sustain any serious injuries, but his complexion had turned pale. Also, his hat had disappeared from his head. The black-robed man crawled to his feet, and shot a resentful look at the people in front of him. Yu Yi held a hat in his hand, and his face was glistening with a blissful look. A number was gleaming on the surface of this hat. It was 3605. This was Yu Yi's target. "What's wrong? Does your excellency still wish to fight back?" He turned his hand and took the hat while his eyes gazed at the black-robed man. A few black-robed silhouettes stood not far from them. A hint of fear crawled across their faces as they saw this scene, so much so that they didn't dare to approach them. Shi Mu stood in front of a small group of people at this time. He held the black blade in his hand. The black-robed man shot another resentful look at Yu Yi. But then, his eyes turned to look at Shi Mu, and a petrified look flashed through his face. He took a long and deep breath. Then, he turned around, and started to walk away. Several other people in the surroundings also retreated and moved far from Shi Mu and his team. Half an hour had passed since the beginning of the competition. And, this group had just accomplished another task with ease. They then continued to push their way through the arena under Shi Mu's leadership. Shi Mu's group had also confronted 2 other teams during this period that had been trying to seize Hosai Lei and Yu Yi's magic hats. The competition's rules didn't allow the participants to inflict injuries on the opposite party to obtain their hat. So, Shi Mu's group had no other choice but to rely on a method that could force the opposite party to retreat. However, this method didn't involve any difficult tasks. They simply had to shoot down the magic hat that their opponents wore. This was enough to get their opponent disqualified. Thus, it was an easy way to defeat the people who aimed for these 5 people's magic hats. Yu Yi and his 2 friends' target hats had been collected by this time. Now, they had to seize only Shi Mu and Hosai Lei's target hats. Thanks to Brother Mu that we could collect these 3 hats so quickly. Yu Yi looked at Shi Mu with gratitude and said. This is only a trivial matter, Shi Mu replied. We 3 people's targets have been taken care of. Brother Mu, we have to look for your and Brother Ho's targets now. May I know the location of your target? Yu Yi said. Come with me. Shi Mu waved his hand, and walked in a particular direction along with them. His and Hosai Lei's target had been under his close watch this entire time. Therefore, Shi Mu had been very relaxed and carefree in this regard. Shi Mu stopped, and then looked straight ahead after a moment. There was a small team of 7 or 8 people in the front. They were a few hundred feet away from them. A red-robed man seemed to be the leader of this group. He was a tall man with a fairly robust stature. He held a red-hilted blade in his hand. Hosai Lei's eyes lit up when he saw that the hat on that red-robed man's head contained his target number. However, the opposite party had also sensed the presence of Shi Mu and his team members. Therefore, they had also tightened their guard. Let's begin! Shi Mu shouted in a low voice. Then, he turned his hand, took out a stack of brown magic charms, and crushed them. Expansive yellow lights converged together, and took the shape of a light screen that was several feet in size. Then, Shi Mu threw it toward the red-robed man and his team members. The red-robed man became startled. However, he jumped to the side at a lightning speed, and escaped the yellow screen. However, his companion's strength was inferior to him. Their bodies tightened as soon as they got enveloped by the yellow light screen. Then, a thread of the yellow light coiled around their bodies in such a manner that they found it extremely difficult to even raise their hands. In fact, it seemed as if they had fallen into a quagmire. Earth Prison Magic Charm. The red-robed man's complexion changed. The Earth Prison Magic Charm was cast right before the enemy confrontation in order to catch the enemy off guard and lock their lower halves. It was a very practical magic charm, and was classified as one of the rarest magic charms among the middle-grade magic charms. In fact, there was often no market price for this charm. But, the person in front of the red-robed man had drawn out so many of them, and had trapped all of his companions in one fell swoop. The red-robed man's eyes flashed as if he was about to take an action. But then, a mass of mist gushed out in front of him. It was followed by a lofty 10 feet tall human skeleton that appeared amid the mist. It held a large pitch-black bone blade. The blade was almost half the size of a human, and was curled up in a mass of black smoke. A pair of blue soul flames were gleaming in that skeleton's eyes. This skeleton was a dead spirit creature that possessed the strength of a Xian Tian-ranked warrior. Hosai Lei then mumbled something, and pointed his finger at the red-robed man. The gigantic skeleton issued a low roar. After that, it stormed toward the red-robed man while brandishing its black blade. Yu Yi stood on the sidelines at this moment. He also recited an incantation, and a streak of green light darted from his hand the next moment. The light then turned into a wind blade, and hacked toward the red-robed man. A stern look flashed through the red-robed man's eyes when he saw this scene. He turned his hand and pulled out a red blade. The edge of his blade was smeared with a hint of blood-red color. The long red blade exuded a dazzling red radiance the next moment, and a dreadful blade chi pervaded the air. After that, the red-robed man stamped his foot on the ground in a fierce manner, and disappeared from the place. Puff puff puff. Consequently, the wind blade that had been shot by Yu Yi hacked in the void where the red-robed man had stood, and ended up empty-handed. Then, the red-robed man reappeared in front of the Xian Tian-ranked human skeleton like a ghost, and brandished his blade to chop it down. His blood-red blade hacked at the left shoulder of the skeleton. An arc-shaped blood-red blade light flashed out of the blade, and cleaved the skeleton's body. The skeleton's body shook, and divided into 2 parts with a crisp cracking sound. Then, its 2 halves fell to the ground. Hosai Lei was profoundly shocked when he saw this scene. You want to seize my hat? Then, you'll have to pay the price for it. The red-robed man's eyes flashed with a trace of cold look. Then, the blood-red blade in his hand radiated bright light once again, and hacked toward Hosai Lei's head in a very vengeful manner. It seemed as if the red-robed man had stopped caring about the rules of the competition. Hosai Lei was startled. He immediately flew backwards in retreat. Then, a grey light flashed in front of his body as he had summoned a bone shield before his body to block the attack. Ka-cha! However, the blood-red blade light slashed the bone shield in two halves with a flash of light. Moreover, the momentum of the blade light didn't reduce a bit after the impact. On the contrary, it increased and shot toward Hosai Lei once again. But then, Shi Mu's silhouette flashed and appeared beside Hosai Lei like a ghost. Shi Mu grabbed Hosai Lei's body, and pulled him backwards. Simultaneously, he raised his black blade with his other hand to receive the blood-red blade light. Clang! A loud metal clanging sound rang out. The red-robed man's body received a powerful jolt because of the impact, and he was forced to move backwards. He retreated a few steps in a continual manner before he was able to stabilize his body to stand on firm footing. This incident shocked him profoundly. He shot a look at Shi Mu, who had abruptly appeared in front of him, and a look of surprise surfaced on his face. "Thank you. Brother Mu, you saved me," Hosai Lei said. A faint trace of fear was still lingering in his heart. He then expressed gratitude to Shi Mu while keeping his voice lowered. However, Shi Mu looked somewhat absent-minded at the moment. His eyes were stuck to the black blade in his hands, and there was a thoughtful expression on his face. Shi Mu then lifted his head, and looked at the red-robed man who stood not far from him. "Don't let them escape." Shi Mu had barely finished his words when his silhouette flashed, and he dashed toward the red-robed man. Simultaneously, his black blade turned into a dark shadow as he hacked it towards that man. Yu Yi and the other people heard these words, and rushed towards the red-robed man's companions who had been trapped by the earth prison technique. The red-robed man naturally couldn't sit back and wait for his death. He thundered loudly, and the Xian Tian real qi in his whole body surged up and gushed straight into his blade. Then, a dazzling blood-red luminescence bubbled up on the surface of his long blade as he wielded it to meet Shi Mu's attack. Ping! A loud sound was heard. Two blades, one red and the other black, collided with each other in the air. Shi Mu's eyes were fixedly staring at the black blade in his hand. The fact was that he had noticed that the surface of his black blade had flashed, and a wisp of strange black light had appeared on it when it had collided with the red blade. The red blade had been exuding a blood-red light. But, Shi Mu had noticed that the greater part of this blood-red blade light had gotten gobbled up as soon as it had come in contact with that wisp of strange black light. And, the red blade light had dimmed after that collision. The red-robed man felt as if an immense force had surged up in a violent manner to render a severe jolt to his body. He drew a few steps back after the impact. Even his arm had experienced such a powerful shock that his long red blade had nearly been sent flying. Shi Mu didn't chase him. Instead, he simply gazed at the black blade in his hands. The strange radiance that had just appeared on his black blade had vanished by now. However, his blade's weight seemed to have increased. Shi Mu's heart overwhelmed with ecstasy since he had discovered something wonderful. His black blade seemed to possess a strange power now. It could devour his opponent's real qi-based attacks. His heart thumped as he related this incident with Yan Luo's matter from before. The material of this meteoric iron seemed to be a treasure indeed. "You're courting death. So, I'm going to be merciless now." A spurt of ominous glint gushed into the red-robed man's eyes as he thundered at the top of his voice. After that, his body inflated and his skin became dark green. Moreover, a layer of thick black hair sprouted over his entire body. He had transformed into a zombie. The red-robed man bellowed after the transformation. Simultaneously, the long blade in his hand exuded bright rays of light. He then dashed toward Shi Mu like a raging storm along with the blood-red blade light and a plentiful amount of real qi. "Brother Mu, watch out!" Yu Yi and others weren't far from the scene. They suddenly called out in alarm to alert Shi Mu. These people knew that Shi Mu practiced both the martial art and the magic art. In fact, they had seen both of his arts in action while they were seizing the hats. Moreover, they had found out that his martial strength wasn't inferior to that of a Xian Tian warrior. However, their complexion still changed when they saw that the opponent in front had resorted to zombie art. It could be said that the zombie art lacked intelligence. However, it rendered the caster an iron-like solid body once it was practiced to the Xian Tian realm. In addition, it also strengthened the caster's real qi to such an extent that an ordinary magic tool would fail to inflict any injury. Furthermore, it also increased the caster's strength by a big margin, so much so that it exceeded that of a Xian Tian primary stage warrior by far. However, Hosai Lei was familiar with Shi Mu's real strength. So, he was calm and composed. Shi Mu revealed a mischievous smile, and a strange gleam streaked across his eyes. He didn't draw back. Instead, he moved forward to receive the attack. He had discovered only a few secrets of his black blade during this fight. So, he obviously wanted to seize this fortuitous opportunity to dig out a little more information in this regard. Chapter 287, Suspicion Arises. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Ping ping ping. The two people's weapons collided with each other repeatedly. Also, two blade shadows, one red and one black, mixed together, and issued waves of shrill metal clanging sound. The black blade in Shi Mu's hand was dancing in the air in a swift and convenient manner. Each of his gestures was displaying the Gale Force blade art. He hadn't displayed many different blade shadows so far. However, his blade art continued to change in an irregular manner. Sometimes it was swift and fierce, and sometimes it was flexible but strong. This could make a person feel like giving up. Shi Mu continued to receive every single attack of his opponent with ease regardless of how fierce it was. Yu Yi and his friends were left stunned when they saw this situation. Shi Mu gradually figured out the pattern that his black blade was following to devour the real qi of his opponent's attacks as their weapons continued to clash for some time. His black blade had the ability to engulf the real qi of his opponent's weapon the instant it made contact with it. In fact, his black blade could gobble up the real qi contained in his opponent's attacks as well as his opponent's weapon. It couldn't be denied that the rate of engulfing was slow. However, it could quickly deplete his opponent's strength during the battle. So, the result couldn't be denied either. After all, the slightest difference could sometimes affect the outcome of the battle when two experts vied against each other. The red-robed man continued to launch attacks in a fierce manner for a while. But, his real qi was accordingly depleting at a very fast pace. And so, his attacks failed to be as strong as he wished them to be. Consequently, his blade art gradually started to become more and more disorganized. And, he began to curse himself in his heart. Shi Mu had almost obtained the desired result by now. Therefore, he had no intention to continue struggling with this person. He stimulated the real qi in his hand and his blade sped up all at once. Clang clang clang. Shi Mu displayed 13 series of Gale Force blade art 3 times in a short time. Simultaneously, he also launched 3 10-feet-long black blade lights. They intertwined and hacked towards his opponent with an imposing aura. The red-robed man was startled to see the scene, and waved his long red blade to receive the blow. However, his body received a profound jolt, and he was forced to retreat by the impact once again. He felt as if a wave of numbness had gripped his entire arm even though he was in his zombie form right now. The fact was that Shi Mu was concerned about the competition's rules. Therefore, he hadn't been using his full strength in this battle. Shi Mu took advantage of the blade lights that he had just shot, and arrived close to his opponent's body like a shadow following his body. Then, the blade light changed its direction. It then transformed into a regiment of blade shadows, and wrapped around the red blade in the red-robed man's hands. The red-robed man's arm was already numb. So, there was no way he could continue to hold the blade. Consequently, the blade left his hand, and was sent out flying in the air. Shi Mu seized this opportunity, and landed a punch on the man's chest with a loud ping sound. The man was sent flying in the air by the impact. The strength of this punch was barely enough to defeat his opponent. It had sent his opponent flying in the air. But, it hadn't inflicted any severe injuries on the red-robed man who was currently in his zombie form. The red-robed man hadn't even touched the ground when a white chain darted out, and bundled his body. The red-robed man crashed heavily to the ground with a loud thump sound. After that, the black hair on his body started to recede at a fast speed. At the same time, his bulging green body also returned to its original state. Hosai Lei had been waiting on the sidelines for some time now. He saw this situation, and his eyes sparkled with an exhilarated look. He took a few quick steps forward, and snatched away the hat from the man's head. After that, he retreated at a lightning speed. The red-robed man's eyes were smeared with a resentful look. But, he couldn't stop his enemy from preying on him since he had lost more than 50% of his real chi during this battle. In addition, his body was tied up with the white chi chain. So, he couldn't budge. Well, let's go. Shi Mu received his blade and retreated when he saw that Hosai Lei had taken hold of his target hat. He then waved his hand to untie the white chi chain. The red-robed man stood up afterwards. His body had returned to its original state by now. He threw a glance at Shi Mu, and let out a sigh of helplessness. After that, he picked up his blade, and walked away. The companions of the red-robed man were then released from the firm clutch of earth prison technique. But, they didn't dare to jump into a battle with Shi Mu since they had witnessed the entire battle between him and the red-robed man. So, they withdrew, and went far from Shi Mu and his team. The battles in the arena seemed to have heated up to a great extent while Shi Mu had been occupied in capturing the magic hat for Hosai Lei. There were many people in the arena who had lost their patience and rationality with the passage of time. And, their anxiety had made them ruthless. After all, not everyone could tolerate such a bizarre rule. So, the eruption of such conflicts had led to mass casualties. Simultaneously, an increasingly high number of people had been disqualified from the competition, and had been taken away by the managing disciples. On the other hand, many people had been directly promoted to the next round owing to this chaos. There were barely 3,000 people left in the arena at this time even though less than an hour had passed since the beginning of this round. Only my hat is left to be seized now. Everyone, wait for a few moments. Shi Mu looked at the hats in Yu Yi and the other three people's hands and said. After that, he sneaked into the crowd at the front in a horizontal position like a swimming fish. Yu Yi and the others hadn't even responded when they noticed that Shi Mu had already disappeared from their sight. In the distance, Shi Mu's whole body was shrouded by a thin layer of green light, and he seemed to be flying at this time. He arrived at a particular place in the arena in a matter of few seconds. Then, he appeared in front of a four-man squad, and stood in their way. He directed his gaze at a lanky man among them. He gazed at that man in an unrestrained and fearless manner. The magic hat on top of that man's head contained the number that Shi Mu was looking for, 430. The four members of the squad hadn't been able to see Shi Mu coming over. A silhouette had flashed in front of their eyes, and Shi Mu had suddenly appeared in front of them. Shi Mu's eyes seemed cold and piercing like that of a falcon. However, the lanky man immediately thought of something, and a cold and stern look emerged on his face too. He took a step back and then wielded his green jade scepter in front of his body in a horizontal position. I'll offer Your Excellency a bit of advice. Run away. Your Excellency will be killed if he were to target one of the four people in my squad. There was a long-faced middle-aged man among the four people. He seemed to be the leader of this squad. He moved half a step ahead, and shouted in a vicious manner. He held a 1-foot-long green iron ruler in his hand. A few magic characters were winding around the surface of that ruler. The remaining three people spread out and took their positions while the long-faced man was speaking. Then, they pointed their wooden sticks and other magic tools at Shi Mu, and started to mumble something. All four of them were star-ranked magicians. It could be said that the combined strength of these 4 people was both offensive and defensive in nature. In fact, their integrated strength was far beyond the strength of any person present on the scene. The other people had already obtained their target hats by this time. They had to seize only one hat now. So, they drew back as they saw Shi Mu. Moreover, the sudden appearance of Shi Mu had made them think that it was nothing but an act of overestimating one's ability. Therefore, the 4 planned to knock the magic hat off Shi Mu's head with joint forces. This would kick him out of this competition as well as teach him a lesson. But, Shi Mu didn't utter even a single word in response. Instead, his silhouette suddenly turned fuzzy. At the same time, the ground under Shi Mu's feet burst open. Then, several green vines rolled out and tied his feet. These vines were as thick as an adult's arm. After that, a wave of several ice cones, wind blades, and fireballs departed from the other 3 magicians' magic tools, and they stormed toward Shi Mu from 3 different directions to knock off his hat. But then, Shi Mu's silhouette suddenly dispersed. It was only his remnant shadow. Shi Mu appeared behind the 4 people the next moment. The black blade in his hand flashed, and changed into 4 blade lights which then darted toward the 4 people. The 4 people were alarmed. They quickly whirled around and stimulated their magic tools in an attempt to display some magic techniques. Bang! An intense chaotic sound was heard. The 4 men were thrown into a panic, but they were able to block all 4 blade lights in the end. They were surprised to see that Shi Mu had withdrawn a few feet away from them. But then, they noticed that there was a magic hat in Shi Mu's hand. The lanky young man was thunderstruck. He touched his head, and found that his hat was gone. His complexion profoundly changed as a result. Shi Mu had attacked the 4 people, and compelled them to resist his attack. All of this had happened in an instant. Surprisingly, he had still gotten the time to snatch away the hat from the lanky young man. So, it was evident that there was a huge disparity in their strengths. I would like to thank Your Excellency for his hat, and for letting me win this match. Shi Mu clasped his hands across his chest and said. Then, his stature flickered and swept far away from them. He had quickly disappeared from the 4 people's field of view. The other 3 men cast a sympathetic look at the lanky young man. They thought that he ought to have bad luck today since he had to deal with such a dreadful enemy in this match. Meanwhile, Yu Yi and the other 3 people had retreated to the corner of the arena, and stood firm there. They were watching around in a vigilant manner. I made you wait for so long. A person's silhouette appeared. It was Shi Mu who had hurried over from afar. This dear friend Mu seems to be joking. You have obtained the hat in only a few minutes. It's truly admirable. Yu Yi looked at the hat in Shi Mu's hands, and said in a praising manner. I hadn't expected that dear friend Mu could be such a splendid martial warrior as well as a magician at the same time. And, that too at such a young age. We might not have passed through this round in such an effortless manner if dear friend Mu hadn't been by our side. The young man surnamed Luo and the young woman surnamed Yi also sighed with overwhelming emotions. Ho Sai Lei was silently looking at Yu Yi and his 2 friends. He was pleased in his heart. He was glad that he had followed the right man. You guys are overpraising me. We should go down the arena since everybody has taken hold of their respective hats. This will also save us from long delay and unnecessary troubles. Shi Mu said. The other 4 people naturally didn't have any objection to this. So, the 5 people walked down the arena. They were led by one of the managing disciples to a small palace near the arena. Congratulations on forcing your way through the second round of the competition. Please come along with me. A middle-aged man walked out of the palace, and welcomed them. Then, he walked into the palace along with the 5 people. These people arrived at the side hall in a few moments. More than 100 disciples of the Dark Moon cult were already standing in the palace. These people were obviously the winners of the second round. You wait a moment here. Someone will lead you to the venue for the third round of the competition, the middle-aged man said to the 5 people. The third round is going to start right away. Yu Yi looked shocked as he asked. Yes, but I'm unsuitable to disclose the specific details. Many other people have also been waiting here for a while. Someone will naturally give you a proper explanation about this matter later. The middle-aged man performed a ritual to greet them. Then, he turned around and walked out of the side hall. Then, let's wait here, Shi Mu said while sweeping his gaze around. It seemed that the winners of the second round were being led off in batches, as it was highly unlikely that only 100 or so people had made it through the second round. A lot of seats had been arranged in this hall for these people. Therefore, Shi Mu and the 4 people had immediately found a place to sit. A stream of people continued to arrive at the side hall with the passage of time. Almost 200 people had assembled in the side hall in less than 10 minutes. A side door creaked open at this time, and a young woman walked in. She wore a grey skirt. This person was seemingly in her early 20s. Her facial features and appearance looked rather beautiful. However, there resided an ice-cold expression on her face that faintly revealed a kind of malignant feeling. Shi Mu sensed this woman's aura, and was astounded to find that she was an earth-ranked powerhouse. It seemed that she was either one of the elders, or one of the palace lord of the Dark Moon cult. The other people in the hall had also seen this woman. So, they quieted down. You people will come with me, the young woman said while sweeping her gaze over these people. After that, she walked to the corner of the hall, and patted the wall twice. A 10 feet high arched entrance split open in the wall with a burst of dull caw-caw. It was pitch dark inside. It couldn't be said where the path inside was leading to. Everyone, follow me. I will lead you to the venue for the third round, the grey-skirted woman said and walked into the entrance first. The people in the side hall gazed at each other for a moment. Then, they stepped forward and followed her. I feel that this selection round is rather mysterious. I wonder what our objective in this round will be. Yu Yi whispered. Stay calm and observe the change. Shi Mu nodded. His mind was also clouded by similar kind of doubts. In fact, he had always felt at the back of his mind that something fishy was going on here. Shi Mu didn't enter the entrance immediately. But, he looked toward the entrance of the side hall. A small multicolored figure flew over from the entrance of the side hall and landed on Shi Mu's shoulder at this moment. It was Cai. Yu Yi and the other people looked at Shi Mu in astonishment. Let's go. Shi Mu didn't explain anything. He simply lifted his foot, and stepped into the entrance first. Chapter 288, Catastrophe. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The entire ancient Xixia country had been experiencing an unprecedented and massive catastrophe when the second round of competition for the sea trip had been in full swing like a raging fire. The 2 biggest forces of the eastern continent had been sweeping away many strongholds and subalters of the Dark Moon cult with overwhelming strength, as if a whirlwind had been trying to sweep away the clouds. The Dark Moon cult was revered as the national cult of the ancient Xixia country. And, it had strived hard for thousands of years. Therefore, the domestic believers of this cult had naturally reached an unprecedented number. These believers didn't possess much rebellious power. Still, they had been obliterated in this catastrophe along with the disciples of the Dark Moon cult. After all, eradication of heresies alone was a sufficient reason to kill people for the heavenly demon sect and the immortal cult. In fact, it didn't even matter to the attackers whether the target possessed martial strength or not. However, this kind of behavior seemed just and plausible to the attackers, especially after that incident at the Heavenly U City's Immortal Auction. In fact, this incident had wiped out even the last bits of scruples that resided in their hearts. The entire ancient Xixia country had been flooded with the blood of the victims. These 2 mighty forces had finally arrived at their destination today, the gloomy Corpse Mountains. The main altar of the Dark Moon cult was located under the Pangu Peak. The tall and erect Pangu Peak seemed to be touching the sky. It was shrouded by a layer of enormous grey light screen at the moment. This light screen seemed to be made of a real substance. Numerous magic characters were flowing on its surface. Moreover, a grey mist had thoroughly pervaded the air around the peak. A large number of disciples of the Dark Moon cult could be vaguely seen through the translucent grey light screen. They stood on the mountain peak. Every single one of them was dressed in a grey robe. There were approximately 10,000 people on the peak. And, they were arranged in a strict battle array to meet the imminent challenge. These people included the disciples who had withdrawn from the arena after they had been eliminated in the second round of competition. Those disciples had been sent to the main altar through the teleportation spell. They looked toward the numerous dense shadows of the people that had occupied the surrounding mountainous regions of the Pangu Peak with a flabbergasted and horrified look in their eyes. The majority of people on the northern side of the Pangu Peak were dressed in black robes, while the southern region was crowded with blue-robed people. However, the number of people on either side was almost the same. There were around 5,000 or 6,000 people on either side. The disciples of the Dark Moon cult noticed that the black-robed and the blue-robed silhouettes were still converging respectively from the north and the south like two unending streams. This process continued for a while. The number of people on either side had reached above 10,000 after all the black-robed and blue-robed people had arrived below the peak. Two huge semicircles, one black and one blue, could be seen below from the peak. They had encircled the Pangu Peak in such a manner that it seemed that not even a drop could trickle through. On the southern side of Pangu Peak, the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult's disciples could be seen in the air as far as the eye could see. They were floating on a massive blue bottle gourd. A white-haired elderly man was also seated on top of it. He was clad in a trigram Taoist robe. He had a childlike face and crane-like white hair. His eyes were closed, and there was a horsetail whisk in his hand that leant on his shoulder in a casual manner. This person was Old Man Wu Chen, the head of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult. 6 Taoist people were seated behind him. Old Man Wu Chen's lips slightly moved, as if he had transmitted something. After that, 3 Taoist escorts sprang up from a crowd of a dozen or more people. They cupped their hands toward Old Man Wu in a submissive manner, and jumped down the bottle gourd. This scene soon sparked off a tumultuous reaction in the disciples underneath. Then, a troop of over 1,000 people of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult branched out of the crowd, and advanced toward Chuyang City that was located not far toward the south. On the northern side of Pangu Peak, over 10,000 black-robed disciples were floating high up in the air. They were floating on a massive palm leaf fan that was more than 200 feet in size. A mass of black mist was curling around the surface of the palm leaf fan. A man and a woman stood side by side in the front. The man was seemingly 30 or 40 years old. He was dressed in a scholarly robe, and had simple and elegant facial features. There was a calm and contented look on his face at the moment. He was gazing toward the gigantic grey mountain peak in front of him. The woman was clad in a black cloak. However, golden apparel could be faintly seen inside the cape. A hint of mesmerizing charm added a graceful aura to her exquisite appearance. These two people were Prior Hao, the head of the Heavenly Demon Sect, and Jin Xiaochai. A dozen or more tall figures also stood behind the two people. Their whole bodies seemed to be covered by a layer of black fog. A cold and indifferent look could be seen in their eyes, while their faces were smeared with a kind of stern yet dull expression. Prior, is this the Dark Moon cult's main altar? Jin Xiaochai asked. To be more accurate, this is the main altar of the Dark Moon cult in the eastern continent, Prior Hao replied. Is it possible that they have power in the western continent as well? Jin Xiaochai was startled. Yes. This is only a glimpse of the Dark Moon cult's power. Xiaochai, aren't you looking for someone? The boy should be in the Chuyang City as far as I know. Prior Hao nodded and changed the thread of conversation before she could ask another question. Prior, you had promised me something before. Please let him go in case you bump into him by chance, Jin Xiaochai said. That boy is a disciple of my Heavenly Demon Sect. So, I won't make things difficult for him if he hasn't overstepped the bounds of righteousness. You have the strength of a Xiantian advanced stage warrior now. However, Wu Chen has already dispatched a group of people to encircle and suppress the Chu Yang city. So, I think it would be better to send 2 heavenly demon guards along with you there in order to guard against any contingencies." Prior Hao waved his hand while talking to her. The next moment, 2 lofty silhouettes walked out from behind, and stood behind Jin Xiaochai. "Thank you so much, Prior." Xiaochai takes her leave now. Jin Xiaochai turned her head and glanced at the 2 silhouettes behind. Then, she said. After that, Jin Xiaochai jumped down the gigantic palm leaf fan. The 2 heavenly demon guards didn't speak anything, and followed her closely. Suddenly, a burst of loud and sonorous bugle horns rang out from below. After that, more than 20 puppets of the ferocious beasts appeared in the midst of the disciples of the heavenly demon sect that stood at the foot of the mountain. These puppets were hundreds of feet in size, and they bore a great resemblance to all kinds of ominous beasts in terms of shape and appearance. Moreover, their whole bodies were covered with a layer of either black or grey scales. And, those scales were emanating waves of strong spiritual pressure. These beast-shaped puppets were the eminent spirit tool-ranked fighter puppets of the Black Demon sect. They were very famous in the entire eastern continent. Each one of them required a group of 10-star ranked magicians to control them. In addition, a plentiful amount of spirit stones had to be fed to them just to activate them. Their movement was fairly slow. However, they were capable of destroying the fiercest of defenses. In fact, their strength couldn't be considered inferior to an ordinary Earth-ranked powerhouse. "Attack!" Prior Hao's voice spread from above. His voice wasn't very loud, but it still reached everyone's ears in a crisp and clear manner. The facial expression of these people brightened up with enthusiasm as they heard these words. The magic tools and sharp weapons in these people's hands appeared as if they were dancing. Then, they crowded around the cluster of beast-shaped puppets, and slowly advanced towards the hilltop. Looking from afar, it seemed as if a black ocean was spreading towards the top of the mountain. These people were still some distance away from the summit of the hill, which was shrouded by a great protection formula when they started to launch their attacks. The beast-shaped puppets started to spout light beams of assorted colors from their mouths. These light beams were as thick as a water jar. In addition, a few magicians and some Xian-Tian warriors also moved into action. The grey light screen started to exude bursts of deafening rumbling sounds as these attacks started to fall on it one after another. The surface of the grey light screen gleamed whenever the light beams touched it. The light beams then turned into tiny crystal lights, and subsequently dispersed in the air. Simultaneously, numerous and densely packed miraculous lights and magic spells gushed out of the massive light curtain in response. These lights and spells poured down like a torrential rain, as if they wanted to deliver a frontal attack on the approaching disciples of the heavenly demon sect. However, the heavenly demon sect's disciples were also well prepared. They immediately cast a magic spell, and a large-scale protective shield emerged in front of them. Simultaneously, some Earth-ranked martial warriors flew out, and displayed various kinds of incredible techniques to provide extra protection to their fellow disciples. Most of the counterattacks were blocked by these disciples. However, there were a lot of flaws in their plan. And so, many disciples collapsed and toppled. Almost at the same time, a loud rumbling sound burst out on the other side of the peak. After that, numerous magic power waves proliferated in all directions. Apparently, the people of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult had also started to mount their attack. The war was now on the brink of eruption. The massive grey light curtain of the Great Protection Formula eventually started to tremble under the intense attack. In fact, the entire Pangu Peak started to sway as if an earthquake was occurring. The peak seemed to be issuing a wailing sound at this moment. A large number of middle and low-ranked disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult and the Heavenly Demon sect had arrived in front of the grey light curtain by this time. They were all set to launch a wave of intense attacks on the Dark Moon cult's Great Protection Formula. However, a puff of black smoke suddenly emerged in front of the grey light curtain. Then, the dead spirit world's aura permeated the air as numerous grotesquely shaped zombies and human skeletons started to emerge out of thin air. A large number of human skeletons and black-furred zombies among these creatures were considerably powerful, so much so that they had even attained the Xian Tian rank. In fact, the Skeleton King and the Zombie King among them even possessed a little strength of an Earth-ranked powerhouse. These dead spirit creatures immediately rushed forth, and started to fight the middle and low-ranked disciples of both sects. A vicious and crazy look emerged on the faces of the Dark Moon cult's disciples as they saw this scene. And, they started to issue attacks in an aggressive manner. They used their real chi and magic power without restraint, and slaughtered many disciples of the opposite party by working in coordination with these dead spirit creatures. After all, it would be a dead-end situation for them once their light shield had been broken by the opposite party. However, the disparity between the two sides in terms of the number of people was too large. Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and Heavenly Demon Sect paid a heavy price of thousands of disciples before they were gradually able to take the authority in this battle. The gigantic grey light curtain had also begun to fade since an increasing number of attacks had begun to get aimed at it. In a certain large private room, in the main altar of the Dark Moon cult, a massive hexagonal magic array could be seen on the ground of this room. It was 1,000 feet in size. Brilliant rays of light were flowing on the surface of this magic array, and the array itself was emitting a faint blood-red radiance. In addition, numerous spirit stones were embedded all over the circle. Furthermore, 64 disciples of the Dark Moon cult were dispersed throughout the magic array. They were seated at each key node of the magic array with their legs crossed. Each of them held a blood-red skeleton's head in their hands. Numerous blood-red light beams were being shot from the skeleton heads from time to time. And, those light beams were submerging into the magic array at various places. But, the complexion of these people had started to fade out of exhaustion at such a speed that it was visible to the naked eye. A white-haired old man sat cross-legged at the center of this large array. A deep red round bead was floating in front of him. The surface of this bead was covered with numerous magic patterns. This white-haired old man was the right-wing minister of the Dark Moon cult. He was making gestures with his hands and projecting magic arts in a constant manner. And, those magic arts were constantly hitting the dark red bead in front of him. Gradually, the magic pattern that was drawn on the surface of the bead brightened, and the bead started to spin. Its spinning speed grew faster with each passing second. The white-haired old man then read a few lines of incantation. After that, he opened his mouth and puffed out a mouthful of refined blood on the red bead. A red bead flashed magnificently, and a thick beam of blood light darted out from within it. It went straight toward the void above the secret room, and disappeared after a moment. "Luan, I can only help you in coming here." The white-haired old man's complexion had paled after he had spouted a mouthful of blood. His life force had also started to deplete at a fast pace. The battle on the Pangu mountain peak was still in full swing. A thick layer of human corpses was spread outside the enormous grey light screen around the entire Pangu peak. Many disciples were also among them along with the dead spirit creatures. However, neither Old Man Wu Chen nor Prior Hao had made any move so far. Old Man Wu Chen was still on the bottle gourd on the southern side of Pangu Peak, and Prior Hao was still on the huge palm leaf fan on the northern side. But, their facial expression looked almost unchanged. The battle's causalities hadn't affected them much. A strange thing happened at this very moment. The grey mist that had shrouded the mountain peak suddenly rolled and shrank. It then drew back toward the fierce wolf or tiger-like gigantic demon beast skeleton that lay on the top of the mountain peak. The demon beast's whole body gleamed with a splendid blood-red radiance. Then, two groups of pale silver soul flames flared up in the empty sockets of its eyes. These soul flames were several feet in size. Then, its head started to sway in a gentle manner. It seemed as if it had just woken up. Suddenly, extremely powerful magic power waves spread in all directions like ripples. Also, a terrorizing and extremely imposing aura spread, and enveloped the whole mountain peak. Chapter 289, Boards the Ship. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. A tidal wave-like beastly roar spread from the summit of the Pangu peak. Then, the limbs of the massive demon beast skeleton straightened, and the demon beast stood up straight. A burst of loud, rumbling, and chaotic sound spread when the demon beast skeleton pulled out its right claw from within the mountain. The claw was curled up in a grey mist and countless magic characters. The monster skeleton brandished its right claw toward the north side of the Pangu peak where the heavenly demon sect had established its battle array. The void where the claw had just been wielded revealed a fit of fluctuation. After that, over 24 massive grey blade-ons appeared out of thin air, and swept toward the north side of the hill. These grey blades appeared in front of the ferocious tiger-shaped puppet in an instant, as if they had been teleported. The tiger-shaped puppet's front claws flashed with a green light. Then, the puppet pounded its claws in front of its body. A puff sound was heard, and a garret-sized green light shield emerged in front of its body. Bang! A series of loud rumbling sound rang out in the air. A mass of grey and green light burst out as the massive grey blades bombarded the surface of the green light shield one after another. The green light shield had warded off only half of the grey blades when it got shattered into smithereens. However, the momentum of the remaining 10 or more grey blade-ons didn't decline. And, they plummeted down on the tiger-shaped puppet's body within a matter of seconds. A loud rumbling sound was heard again. A mass of grey light exploded over the tiger-shaped puppet's body with a loud sound. The tiger-shaped puppet was sent flying backwards with an overwhelming force. And, it crumbled into pieces right up in the air. Then, a series of blood-curdling screeches rang out for some time. The fact was that 10 star-ranked magicians had been inside the tiger-shaped puppet. And, they had fallen prey to this blow without any exception. Even the dozen disciples that had been around the tiger-shaped puppet hadn't gotten enough time to escape. They had sustained several severe injuries, and had collapsed on the scene. The demon beast skeleton bellowed in a loud manner. Then, it turned its head and stretched open its huge mouth once again. A streak of blood light shot out of its mouth again, and rushed through the air. The void that came in contact with it got twisted and deformed. The disciples of the heavenly demon sect suddenly felt a petrifying spiritual pressure, and their complexions changed one by one. The streak of blood light was about to pound the head of another lofty puppet that was 200 feet in height. This puppet looked like a bear. But then, a crystal light shot up to the sky and appeared in front of the bear-shaped puppet. The crystal light had transformed into a grey shield that was hundreds of feet in size. A miraculous radiance was glistening on this shield's surface. And, its body was filled with various kinds of magic characters. In addition, the surface of this shield was inscribed with an ugly blood-red head that had protruded fangs. The image of this head was rendering a kind of fierce and dreadful feeling. A puff sound was heard. The thick blood light flashed, and then passed through the shield without getting submerged into it. However, the slightest trace of mighty waves didn't emerge afterwards, as if the light had disappeared for eternity. Then, the grey shield turned into a crystal light once again with a flash of light on its surface. It dashed in the air, and instantly appeared in front of Prior How, who stood on top of the hill. It couldn't be said when he had flown over to the peak. Then, the crystal light started to revolve around him. Prior How looked towards another side of the peak, and saw Old Man Wu Chen there. Wu Chen was floating in the air like him. Prior How then said, "Dear friend Wu Chen, it seems that the Dark Moon cult won't send Dongfang Xiantian to deal with us. I think this demon beast is the Dark Moon cult's final trump card. So, we might as well act together to break this big magic spell. This will certainly minimize the casualties." Old Man Wu Chen was about to speak something when the jade bracelet in his hand vibrated. Then, a mild puff sound was heard, and a summoning magic array sprang up out of thin air. Then, a ray of light gleamed in the magic array, and a thin and small purple jade slip emerged out of it. Old Man Wu Chen picked it up, and pasted it on his forehead. His facial expression changed and he said, "Dear friend Prior, it seems that we have given enough time to Luan to execute his secret plan under cover of this battle. A large number of elite disciples of the Eastern Dark Moon cult have already entered the sea by now. We don't have much time to lose. So, I'll forthwith rush to the west coast. I therefore request my dear friend to supervise, and direct the battle here. Old man Wu Chen didn't wait for Prior Hao to respond, and returned to the huge blue gourd that was not far from him. Then, his hands moved to stimulate a magic spell, and a layer of white luminescence bubbled up on the surface of the blue gourd. After that, he flew toward the west coast at a high speed. At the same time, at a remote place on the west coast of Chuyang City, the debris from a dozen or more dilapidated buildings that had stood here before was scattered all over the place. It appeared as if these buildings had been destroyed by some kind of immense force. In addition, this place seemed to have been abandoned a long time ago. The raging wind would often issue boohoo-like wailing sound whenever it whistled through this desolate place. It rather portrayed an image of bleak emptiness. A burst of mild caw-caw sound spread from the ground somewhere in the ruins. Then, a large hole split open in the ground. A flight of stairs extended from the depths to the surface of the ground in this hole. A grey-skirted young woman walked out from inside. A large number of people followed her. They all walked out of the hole one after another. There were altogether 200 people in this group. Shi Mu and his team were also among them. Everyone, follow me. And walk a bit faster. The young woman in the grey skirt looked around a couple of times. Then, she stepped forward, and walked in a particular direction at a very quick pace. The people followed her at a hurried pace. This is the west coast. Yu Yi's nose twitched as he spoke in soft voice. Shi Mu nodded as he had also caught a whiff of the moist and salty odor that pervaded the air. In fact, he could also hear the indistinct sound of sea waves crashing onto the shore. Shi Tiu, don't you think this competition has been mysterious from the beginning? Cai's voice resounded in Shi Mu's mind. Shi Mu groaned in agreement since he had been constantly feeling a sense of uneasiness deep in his heart. It seemed as if the Dark Moon cult had been trying to veil something this entire time. They had even brought these people to the seashore through an underground passage. Do you want me to go, and nose around? Cai said. It's not necessary. It doesn't matter what the Dark Moon cult is plotting since their plan doesn't concern us. We can adapt to any given situation as long as we can go to the western continent through this sea trip. Shi Mu pondered for a moment. Then, he replied via telepathy. The pedestrian group under the command of the grey-skirted woman soon arrived at the seacoast. They saw 6 gigantic black-colored ships that were anchored near the seacoast. Each one of them was 500 feet long with square-shaped head and tail. They looked like 6 small hills. Various kinds of magic characters and patterns had been drawn on these ships from the bow to the stern. Also, they were exuding intermittent bursts of magic power waves. Moreover, they could also see that many other similar gigantic black ships had already been sailing on the surface of the sea. They were a little distance apart from each other, and were gradually drifting away from the seacoast. Are they magic tool-ranked gigantic boats? No, they aren't. They have already reached the category of the spirit tool. Shi Mu looked at the 6 ships in front of him, and was left profoundly shocked. 300 or 400 people had been standing near the coast when Shi Mu and his group had arrived. They were participating disciples like Shi Mu and his group. Those disciples had looked at Shi Mu and his group when they had arrived here. The third round of the competition will be held on an overseas island. Everyone will board the ships in a line according to their achievement order. After that, they will embark on a journey right away. The grey-skirted woman stood firm and raised her voice to make an announcement. Her voice had barely faded when 3 ships slowly approached the shore. Then, boarding ladders were hung down from each of these ships, and a few managing disciples of the Dark Moon cult walked down the ladders. The surrounding disciples started to discuss spiritedly when they watched the massive ships in front of them. Then, they queued up in proper order, and started to board the ship like they had been directed by the grey-skirted woman a moment ago. Shi Mu stood behind Yu Yi and the other people. Then, he started to walk toward the ship's ladder. The first ship's ladder was retracted after it had reached its maximum capacity. After that, everyone started to board the second ship under the guidance of the managing disciples. Yu Yi and his two companions boarded the ship. After that, Ho Sao Lei also climbed up the ladder. Shi Mu was behind Ho Sai Lei. He was about to step on the ladder when he heard a voice. "Hey brother, I'm extremely sorry to say that the ship number 21 has been filled. So, you will have to board ship No. 22. A disciple of the Dark Moon cult put out his hand in front of Shi Mu's body, and blocked his way. After that, the ladder slowly retracted to the ship. Shi Mu was dumbfounded. Ho Sai Lei and the others who had already boarded the ship were also startled to see this. "Then, I will board another ship and meet you again when we reach the destination." Shi Mu didn't seem to care much about it. He waved his hand at Ho Sai Lei and the others on board, and said. Then, ship number 22 came over. A managing disciple stood at the entrance to the ship. The ship's ladder was put down, and Shi Mu was the first person to climb up the ladder. However, his complexion changed as soon as he reached the deck of the ship. He saw that a man stood in front of him with his hands crossed behind his back. He was barely 10 feet away from Shi Mu. He was clad in a pale white long robe. His hair was bright red in color, and he had a pair of straight eyebrows that looked like double-edged swords. Also, a round blood-red moon could be seen in the gap between his eyebrows. It was Luan. Luan looked at Shi Mu with a smile on his face. It seemed as if he had been waiting for Shi Mu. He said with a soft chuckle, "Brother Shi, long time no see." Shi Mu's complexion changed again, but he chose to remain silent. Many other disciples had also boarded the ship behind Shi Mu by this time. They revealed a surprised look on their faces when they saw this scene. Luan had been the main disciple of the previous leader Dongfang Xiantian. He was now the head of one of the 10 palaces. In fact, it could be said that his position in the entire Dark Moon cult was second only to the left-wing minister and the right-wing minister. There was also a rumor that he was the chosen successor of the former head Dongfang. Luan commanded awe-inspiring fame throughout the cult, so much so that most of the people were familiar with his name. On the contrary, Shi Mu was an ordinary and unimportant person with no name and fame. So, they hadn't thought that Luan, who was such a dynamic figure of the cult, would step forward and greet Shi Mu. Who could have thought that you would participate in this selection competition? Don't tell me you have finally changed your mind, and become a member of our cult. Luan smiled as he asked. Would your excellency kick me out of this ship if I said no? Shi Mu asked. He, of course not. Brother Shi, you rest assured. You can travel by this ship. This is going to be a very long and wearisome voyage that will be full of hardships. But still, I might get a chance to sit side by side, and have a long conversation with Brother Shi. We could tell each other about our attainments as a soul magician. What do you think about it? Luan said with a chuckle. Shi Mu's eyes revealed an astonished look as he heard these words. I still have some matters to take care of. Let's talk later. Luan chuckled and nodded to Shi Mu. Then, he pointed his foot below, and his body floated down the ship. Shi Mu looked at Luan's silhouette from behind, and a puzzled look appeared on his face. Then, he lifted his foot and walked inside. He then found a place to sit down. The other disciples also got on the ship, and took a seat at various places. Soon, the entire ship was packed to its maximum capacity. Shi Mu looked around, and saw that there were altogether 200 participants on the ship, including him. In addition, a few managing disciples of the Dark Moon cult could also be seen on both sides of the ship. They seemed to be in charge of controlling this ship. These managing disciples bore a calm and composed expression on the surface. However, a trace of restlessness could still be seen peeping through their mask of calmness. Also, these disciples were often looking in a particular direction. A majestic mountain range which was shrouded in a grey mist could be vaguely seen in that direction. It was the gloomy Corpse Mountain range where the main altar of the Dark Moon cult was situated. Shimi's brows creased. He had a vague premonition of an unpleasant situation. The massive sails of these 3 ships were slowly raised after all the disciples on the shore had boarded. Then, the ships began to depart from the shore. The grey-skirted young woman stood against the wind below these 3 gigantic vast sea boats. She didn't board any of these ships. Her grey clothes were making sounds from fluttering in the air. A white silhouette flashed, and landed beside the grey-skirted woman at this moment. It was Luan who had floated over from afar. After that, another robust middle-aged man also walked over from the side of the 3 empty ships. There was a knife-cut scar on his face. It extended from his forehead to the chin. It seemed rather terrifying. The aura around this man was very profound. He was an Earth-ranked martial warrior. Chapter 290, Final Moments. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Palace Lord Lu, the grey-skirted young woman performed a ritual to greet Luan along with the man with a scar on his face. Palace Lord Peng, you're in charge of these 3 gigantic vast sea boats. They are already at full capacity. So, you should set off. Luan looked at the grey-skirted woman, and said. Palace Lord Lu, what about you? The grey-skirted woman asked after a momentary hesitation. I and Palace Lord Luo will provide support to the last batch of disciples. So, you take your leave first. We will converge at sea at the right time. Luan looked toward the gloomy Corpse Mountain range while he was speaking. The mountain was still covered in mist. However, the grey mist over there seemed to be less dense than before. The grey-skirted woman hesitated a bit. But then, she complied in a low voice. She then turned around and boarded the number 22 gigantic vast sea boat. Shi Mu was also on this ship. Set out. She stood at the bow of the ship, and gave an order in a loud voice. The 3 mighty black ships spread their sails, and changed the direction in a slow manner. After that, they started to sail away from the seacoast. The grey-skirted woman turned her hand, and took out a grey compass. She then mumbled something, and pointed her finger at the compass. The next moment, the mysterious magic characters that had been drawn on the surface of these 3 large boats started to gleam, and vein-like green patterns started to emerge on the surface of the sails. The air started to flow out of nowhere, and propped up the ship's sails. The sailing speed of these 3 boats increased as a result, and they rushed forth at a lightning speed. They drifted further and further away from the sea coast as time passed. The last 3 ships still have to embark on their journey. Let's hope that we'll have enough time to get them ready for sail. Luan heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that the 3 ships had gradually drifted far from the coast. 22 gigantic vast sea boats had successfully begun their voyage from this seacoast by now. This indicated that more than 4,000 elite disciples of the Dark Moon cult had been packed off. The Eastern Dark Moon cult was struggling with a lot of internal problems as well as external worries these days, so much so that the cult seemed to be on the verge of falling apart. In such a scenario, it was incredibly difficult to accomplish this mission without tumbling into any problems en route. Therefore, Luan had also paid a heavy price in this regard. This was the reason why the Dark Moon cult had still continued to preserve its inheritance even though the Xixia country was on the brink of demolition. However, the cult was also desperate since they had a glimmer of hope when it came to staging a comeback someday. Palace Lord Lu, you should also leave. I assure you that the last batch of disciples will be sent off safely under my guidance. The scar-faced man retracted his vision from the 3 ships that were drifting away as he said. It's no bother. I have just received a message from the meeting room that the competition has marked its conclusion. So, the last batch of disciples is on their way, Luan replied. Luan's voice had barely faded when sounds of footsteps was heard. They seemed to be approaching from afar. The 2 people's gaze drew toward the source of the sound. They then saw that 500 or 600 disciples were advancing towards them under the leadership of a grey-robed middle-aged man. The grey-robed middle-aged man saw Luan and the other man from afar, and his silhouette flashed and swept toward them, as if he was flying. Then, he cupped his hands toward Luan and the scar-faced man, and spoke up with a sense of deep respect, "Respected palace lords, the competition has marked its end. This is the last batch of disciples, 567 people in total. These disciples have been brought here, while the rest of the people have stayed behind to take care of things in Chuyang City. Very good. Make everyone board the ship as quickly as possible and set sail right away." Luan nodded and ordered. "Yes," the middle-aged man complied. He then gathered those 500 people in order to begin the boarding process. Luan's gaze shifted towards the Pangu peak of the gloomy Corpse mountain range where the Dark Moon cult's main altar was established, and his brows tightly creased. He didn't know why he couldn't shake off that trace of apprehension in his heart. And, this feeling grew increasingly intense as time passed bit by bit. He then turned his head and looked toward the ships. He noticed that 2 of the 3 ships had already been filled even though only a little time had passed. And, the last few dozens of people were boarding the last boat at their full speed. Moreover, the 3 gigantic vast sea boats that Shi Mu and the others had boarded, had already drifted far from the coast. "It's the last few moments of this mission, but I'm still very apprehensive." Luan withdrew his gaze. His facial expression looked calm at this moment, but he muttered to himself in a somewhat self-deprecating manner. It could be said that the plan had gone smoothly so far. The main forces of Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and Heavenly Demon Sect ought to be dealing with the main altar of the Dark Moon Cult at this time. It couldn't be denied that the enemy was very formidable. But, the great formula for mountain protection was set up there, and that should be enough to resist them. In addition, the right-wing minister was himself present there to lend a hand. So, it wasn't possible to break through the defense very easily. Luan only needed a little time so that the last batch of disciples could enter the Yellow Sea. After that, no matter how fierce the 2 major forces were, they couldn't do anything to them. Instead, they would feel powerless and frustrated at their incompetence. Some time passed. The last disciple had finally boarded the ship. The scar-faced man leapt onto the last boat, and looked at Luan. "Palace Lord Lu, everyone has got on the ships. Set off at once." Luan also got on the ship, and stood alongside the scar-faced man. Then, he issued an order. "Evildoer, stop running away." A stern and loud voice spread from afar. The voice seemed to be filled with dignity, while blazing with wrath. After that, a thick beam of white light flew over from the distant horizon at an inexplicably fast speed. An astonishingly formidable spiritual aura also swept over the ships as this happened. And, it shrouded thousands of feet of the surrounding space in a fraction of a second. Then, a massive blue bottle gourd appeared before them. It was curled up in a mass of white light. 3 or 4 persons' silhouettes could be vaguely seen on top of that gourd. The leader of this group was a crane-like white-haired elderly man. He had a baby-like face, and was clad in a blue Taoist robe. He held a horsetail whisk, and his eyes were glistening with an exquisite gleam. Old Man Wu Chen. Luan's complexion profoundly changed. The scar-faced man stood beside Luan. A flabbergasted look flashed through his face as soon as he heard this name. "Palace Lord Luo, I will hold Old Man Wu Chen here. The disciples of these 3 ships are your responsibility now." Luan didn't even take a moment to think as he stated this. But, the scar-faced man hesitated. "There's nothing to speak of. It's too late." Luan's body darted out like an arrow to meet the white light while he was in the midst of speaking. The scar-faced man gazed at Luan from behind. Then, he stamped his foot and turned around. He then shouted at the top of his voice, "Set out at full speed." The managing disciples who were in charge of controlling these 3 boats moved into action at once. The magic characters drawn on the surface of these boats lit up within a few breaths. After that, the boats slowly turned, and advanced toward the deep sea. Luan was in midair when he opened his mouth and spouted a tiny dark red banner. Then, a blood-red light flashed, and the banner started to extend until it reached 5 feet in length. A pattern of a pale golden ghost's head was engraved in the center of the banner. It looked vivid and lifelike. The ghost's head was surrounded by various kinds of spirit patterns. It rendered a rather strange and mysterious feeling. Luan held out his hand to grip the pole of the banner. He then raised it against the wind. Bang! The banner flew out of his hand, and began to expand against the wind until it reached several feet in size. After that, a blood-red magic character rolled in its center, and turned into a mass of red billowing flame. The flame was exuding a faint creaking and groaning sound, as if someone was mourning and wailing inside it in grief. Then, the massive head of a pale golden ghost emerged amid the blazing red flame along with an astonishing spiritual pressure. The ghost's head surged up, and proliferated in all directions. It was 20 or 30 feet in size. After that, the blood-red banner vanished into thin air. Then, a chi-chi sound rang out. The pale golden ghost's head opened its large mouth, and spurted out a blood-red column of flame. This column of flame was as thick as a barrel of water. The blood-red column then rushed forth to receive the white light. The individuals whose silhouettes could be seen in the white light were startled by this. And, they immediately stopped moving the light. However, a green ancient sword darted from the white light. It began to inflate at an incredible speed until it had reached several dozen feet in size. After that, it took a spin, and transformed into a bulky sword shadow. The sword shadow and that column of blood-red flame collided with each other the next moment. Two magnificent halos, one red and one green, also bumped into each other in the air as this happened. A loud and shrill whistling sound soared into the sky as the air vibrated intensely by the impact of this collision. In addition, this explosion set off two strong winds, one green and other red. These winds then proliferated in all directions. The trees and weeds within a range of dozens of feet couldn't escape this strong gale, and got uprooted one after another. Then, countless cracks split open in the ground, and clouds of dust sprang up everywhere. In fact, it seemed as if a layer of sand had been plowed by force. The three large boats that had just departed the shore were also affected by the gust of strong wind. Bursts of exasperation were heard as they shook violently. These Spirit Tool-class gigantic vessels had some sort of defensive barrier. Moreover, they were considerably far from the range of explosion. Therefore, they didn't get affected very strongly by the explosion. Boom! The sounds of a loud explosion was heard again. That column of blood-red flame collapsed and dispersed in the air with a loud rumbling sound. The green ancient sword was also shot and sent flying in the air. Luan waved his hand, and the pale golden ghost's head flew over. Then, it started to hover around the top of his head. The white light on the opposite side finally stopped, and old man Wu Chen's silhouette came into appearance. He was seated cross-legged on the blue gourd. Three persons stood behind him at the rear of the bottle gourd. One of them was a refined Taoist priest, while the other one was a young Taoist man with pure and distinct facial features. The third one was a beautiful Taoist nun. A heavenly ghost banner. I haven't seen this in ages. Old man Wu Chen looked at the pale golden ghost's head on the top of Luan's head, and muttered to himself. Old man Wu Chen, you've arrived here very quickly. But, you'll have to stop at this point, Luan spoke up. He, Dongfang Xian Tian had also used his heaven-ranked cultivation to propel this treasure in those days. Still, he couldn't become a competent match for this old fellow. Now, you're daring to overrate yourself while attempting to do something impossible. It's daunting to think that the younger generation could surpass the older generation. Old man Wu Chen streaked his arm in the void as he spoke. The green ancient sword seemed to have induced its master's mood. It revealed a fit of faint tremors, and then changed its direction. It was pointed straight at Luan now. Luan chuckled, and the pale golden ghost's head dashed straight toward old man Wu Chen. Simultaneously, an enormous blood-red beam rolled out of that ghost's mouth, and hacked toward old man Wu Chen's head. Old man Wu Chen waved his hand, and the green sword changed into a mighty green sword shadow. Then, it rushed forth to receive the pale golden ghost's head. After that, he said to the three people behind him, "Leave this person to me. You three go forward and block those ships." The three people complied. Then, their silhouettes flashed, and they rushed toward the ships. Luan was appalled by this. And, he started to mumble something. After all, he wanted to stop those three people by using any means necessary. However, Old Man Wu Chen clasped his fingers, and many green lights flew out of his fingertips. They then merged into his green sword one after another. After that, a miraculous radiance flashed on the surface of the green sword. Then, a tiny wisp of green silk-like sword chi coiled around the pale golden ghost's head, and restricted its movement. Luan felt as if a shiver had ran down his spine after he saw this. However, he immediately collected his thoughts since he couldn't dare to harbor any useless negative ideas at such a crucial point. He then centralized all of his thoughts to resist the old man. Luan opened his mouth, and spouted a fine strand of blood essence. Then, the blood essence submerged into the pale golden ghost's head. After that, numerous small magic characters appeared, and started to flow on the surface of the ghost's head. A luminous blood-red flame also flared out with a loud bang sound. It burnt down the greater part of the green sword chi, and got Luan out of this hard-pressed trouble. "I've always looked down on you." Old Man Wu Chen snorted in a cold manner when he saw this scene. He then revealed the contemptuous feeling that he had been harboring against Luan this entire time. After that, a blue and a white silhouette shot up to the sky, and began fighting. They'd flutter up and down in the air while fighting over the time that followed. Earth-shaking loud sounds were being produced from their battle from time to time. On the other side, the refined Taoist priest and the other two earth-ranked warriors pounced toward the boat that was nearest to the shore like a bolt of lightning. The gigantic vast sea boats had used magic power to actuate the wind force. Therefore, the speed of these ships' sail was far beyond any ordinary ship. However, this speed was far inferior to the speed of an earth-ranked powerhouse. Consequently, these three people caught up with the ships in a matter of moments. The refined Taoist priest waved his hand, and a purple light shot up to the sky. Then, it flashed and transformed into a flying purple sword. The sword emitted strong waves of spiritual energy. It was clearly a spirit tool. The flying purple sword suddenly emitted a crisp and clear sound, and then spurted out a glaring purple sword chi. The sword chi condensed into a gigantic purple sword shadow that was several feet in size, and hacked down toward one of the ships. The complexion of the 200 disciples on board turned deathly pale. They knew that the ship would shatter into pieces once the gigantic purple sword shadow fell on it. And, all of them would be met with a violent death if that happened. "Stop!" A grey silhouette flashed before that huge purple sword shadow to block its way. It was the scar-faced man. His voice had barely faded when a streak of black light darted out of his hands. And then, a bone-white ring flew out of that black light. The ring appeared to be refined with a beast's bone.